Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining the meeting to discuss the draft final proposal. This is for the Market Enhancements for Summer 2021 Readiness Initiative. This is Christina Osborne with ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be the meeting facilitator. We have James Friedrich. He's from Market and Infrastructure Policy. James is going to start off by reviewing the objectives of this initiative, and then he'll provide a summary of the stakeholder comments we received on the straw proposal. James will also present the proposal for the export load and wheeling priorities topic. And in the afternoon, other members from policy, Danny Johnson, Daniel Table, Teresa Radio, and Gabe Vertaw will present the proposals for the other topics included in this initiative, and then I'll go over the next steps. So also on the speaker line from the ISO, we have Anna McKenna, Mark Rossletter, Bill Weaver, Brad Cooper, Brittany Dean, Don Trethaway, George Angelides, Greg Cook, Guillermo Batista Alderete, James Lynn, John Anders, Rahul Kalskar, and Virginia Thompson. So this graphic depicts the ISO stakeholder process. We are in the final stages of the policy, tariff, and business requirements development for this initiative. The next step will be to go to the EIM governing body and ISO Board of Governors in March for decision. I'll discuss the more detailed schedule at the end. As a reminder, we will be taking questions throughout. After each topic, we'll pause and take questions. At that time, the event producer will instruct you on how to enter the queue. We just ask that you please introduce yourself before asking your question. And also, this call is being recorded. We do provide that recording out on the initial webpage once we receive it from AT&T. Just a reminder to please request permission from the ISO before reprinting any related transcriptions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to James Friedrich.
Before we hand it off to James, this is Mark Rossletter. Can I just make an opening statement?
Yes, please.
All right. So these are very important, and I understand contentious, in some cases contentious issues that we're grappling with. And I want to just alert or make you aware that we take all the comments that we received very seriously, and I hope that you feel like we have been responsive to those comments. And I understand that not everybody is going to like where we landed, and there's going to be still concerns about where things have landed. We certainly want to hear your input, but I want to assure you that we have tried to balance as much as we could under the time frame for this summer. And what we're proposing here is really coming to the limits of our ability to execute and implement for this summer. We've heard the stakeholder input about concerns about doing things that are maybe not as important, and you'll see here that we have scaled back significantly what we're proposing for this summer. But at the end of the day, we have to start preparing for this summer, and we have to balance things out, and we have to be principled about what we're doing here. I reviewed this. We've reviewed this at the management level. We believe this is a fair and an appropriate approach for this summer. We understand that there may be some additional things that people would want to do if we had more time. We are opening to that for the future, but we've got to start moving in the direction of implementing these things. These are challenging issues, and I want to hear people's opinions and views, but as you express your opinions and your views, please be aware that these are not easy issues to tackle. And I ask you to be aware of that. And if you're taking one position, be aware that there's someone on the other side that is equally as passionate about their position in the opposite side. So with that, I look forward to the discussion today. I think, and I appreciate the team's effort to address these issues, and I look forward to seeing how this plays out over the next couple of days. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. James?
Thank you. Good morning. This is James Friedrich with the California ISO's Market Design Policy team, and thank you all for joining us today. Let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to start this discussion by reviewing the objectives of this initiative here on slide 5. So the primary objective of this initiative is to enhance the California ISO's market rules, procedures, and systems to improve supply incentives during tight system conditions and to ensure equitable market outcomes. This includes appropriately balancing the need for the California ISO to reliably serve its balancing authority area's load while providing open access to its transmission system. It also includes better ensuring that each EIM balancing authority area, including the California ISO, participates with sufficient resources. Finally, many of the policy changes proposed here are in response to findings in the joint final root cause analysis. The California ISO is using the events of last summer to identify areas of improvement and work with our stakeholders to make expedient yet thoughtful policy upgrades to mitigate resource supply shortages in the future. Next slide, please. Slide 6 here shows the final list of topics we are considering for this initiative. No additional topics have been added since the draft proposal, but you will notice system market power mitigation is no longer listed here, and we will get into that topic later. And the previously titled Other Items topic, we have renamed it to list out the 2 miscellaneous topics that we are moving forward with at the bottom there. Similar to the straw proposal, my colleagues and I will be presenting each of these topics today. After going through all the material on each topic, we will pause for stakeholder feedback and questions. If you have general questions, that's fine. If you have questions on a specific slide, let us know so that we can flip to that slide as we have the discussion. Next slide, please. So starting on slide 7 and going through the next couple of slides, we've listed out into a table some stakeholder comments and how we have incorporated stakeholder comments into the changes that we've made from the straw proposal and then the rationale behind those changes. So I'll start. The first topic is sort of general. You will notice that in response to stakeholder concerns about the feasibility and prudency of making all of the changes that we proposed in our straw proposal, the implementation feasibility for both the California ISO and stakeholders was pretty much the foundational underlying principle that we used to decide how to go through or which policies to pursue and which not to pursue. You will see in the draft final proposal that we remove certain items from the scope and emphasize in the topics where we presented different options to pursue. We tended to pursue the options that required, a lower implementation lift. So that we can ensure that we can make these changes by the summer. So on the topic of export load and wheeling priorities, we have changed from the straw proposal now that PT exports, which were previously proposed to have a higher scheduling priority than California ISO load, is now proposed to have equal priority. That change is in response to stakeholder comments about concerns that PT exports having a higher priority than load is tough to follow through on because there are additional validation steps that may be necessary to ensure that supply is available through real time. For example, our current validation of these designated resources don't consider outages or commitment status or deliverability. And to implement those validation rules would be complicated, too complex for the summer, and not implementable by summer 2021. An additional change is in response to stakeholder concerns that designated resources may not be forward contracted if they're designated. Also, that resource types that are designated may not be able to meet the hourly block schedules in real time. So we have included additional attestations that when a resource is designated, it is affirming it's both contracted by an external balancing authority area to meet its load and capable of meeting the PT export quantity as an hourly block schedule. I'll note here that on the right-hand side of this table for this row, it says the CISO is creating a new flag in its master file that the resource scheduling coordinator should select if it is unable to attest to the rules. That should, in fact, say if it is able to attest to the rules. The default option will be that a resource is not able to meet the two attestations here, and if the scheduling coordinator does in fact select that they are able, they are affirming that they can meet the two attestations listed here. Finally, we've also included, and which we'll talk about when we get to this topic, that the designated resource supporting an export needs to participate in the RUC process. Next slide, please. A few more things related to export load and wheeling priorities. We have included that PT exports will receive a high priority in the real-time market based on the RUC schedule of the designated resource, and that PT status can also be given to exports that designate a resource with non-RA supply bid into the real-time market above the resource's RUC award. So that attempts to clarify how scheduling coordinators can firm up their RUC schedules. It also supports eliminating the practice of providing all RUC export schedules with higher priority than California ISO load in the real-time market, as is currently done. In relating to wheel-through schedules, in the straw proposal, we had proposed wheel-through schedules would be implemented as LPT, or lower priority status, and we have changed that to give wheel-through schedules PT status, which is equal to a high priority price-taking export and California ISO load. We heard stakeholders express concerns that setting wheel-through schedules at lower priority status was inconsistent with open access. We, behind the scenes, evaluated different approaches that we could use to distinguish between high priority wheels and low priority wheels, perhaps by leveraging our out of balancing authority area load serving entity process. But we decided that the implementation of that would be too complex for this summer, and we are proposing to further consider rules to that effect in an upcoming stakeholder initiative that we can talk about a little more when we get to the export load section. Next slide, please. So continuing with the comments and moving to other topics, for the EIM coordination and resource sufficiency evaluation review, we are unable to prevent resources that cannot be dispatched within the operating hour to count towards the resource sufficiency evaluation capacity test, as we considered in the straw proposal, reason being that simple rules to exempt resources sound straightforward on paper, but when it comes to the implementation, we found complexities that we felt could not be overcome by the summer, and also responding to Department of Market Monitoring's note in their comments that these simple rules could result in additional failures that aren't warranted based on unit commitment decisions made within the economics of the EIM. Also, for the resource sufficiency evaluation review, stakeholders supported a longer-term initiative to review changes to the resource sufficiency evaluation, in which we will discuss the consequences of failing the resource sufficiency evaluation test and that's something that we will discuss a little bit more in the EIM Resource Efficiency Evaluation section. For the market incentives during tight system conditions, we have decided to pursue the option to provide hourly block imports a make-whole payment versus paying or charging the higher of the halves per FMM price, as we considered doing in the straw proposal. This would provide scheduling coordinators with real-time market imports additional protection during hours in which the CAISO anticipates an operating reserve deficiency and should help incentivize import offers, and also minimizes concerns about overlapping import and export bids with the make-whole payment option, because real-time exports are less likely to clear during periods when the CAISO anticipates an operating reserve deficiency. We decided that any alternative option that's using past pricing, we were concerned about going forward with that because the implementation of that is complex and there's concerns with interaction with virtual bids. That's something that we'll talk about more in its relevant section. Next slide. So for real-time scarcity price enhancements, we've decided not to pursue the proposal to scale the real-time markets penalty prices relative to a $2,000 power balance constraint penalty under tight system conditions. Stakeholders were concerned about how this interacts with our proposed FERC Order 831 design. The CAISO has determined that this approach would require extensive effort to work out these interactions and decided that other summer 2021 proposals were higher priority, given that RUC can already ensure sufficient supply to meet demand. And we will consider this, we can consider this policy again in the upcoming comprehensive scarcity pricing initiative on our policy roadmap. For system market power mitigation, the California ISO no longer plans to pursue system level market power mitigation for this summer, to focus on the other changes described in this proposal. The California ISO's current system market power mitigation proposal will be reconsidered in conjunction with the comprehensive scarcity pricing initiative that I mentioned later this year. This is in response to stakeholder concerns that the scarcity pricing element in the system market power mitigation considered together in this initiative did not constitute a balanced approach, and also stakeholder concerns that because of the large list of items proposed in the STRAT proposal, that perhaps system market power mitigation would be, a topic best deprioritized for this summer for now. And that is also in light of evidence or lack of evidence that suppliers have exerted system level market power even during our constrained conditions of last summer. We find it unreasonable to continue to pursue this at this time. For reliability demand response, dispatch, real-time price impacts, we're proposing to expand the bid dispatchable option for these resources from 5 minutes only, as it is today, to include 5, 15, and 60-minute dispatchable options. Stakeholders supported these changes in the STRAT proposal, and it gives RDRRs functionality comparable to PDRs. Next slide, please. Then finally, in the RDRR topic, we're proposing to enable 5 and 15-minute discrete RDRRs to set the price in FMM by treating the resource as discrete in the scheduling run, but then continuous in the pricing run. Again, this is another change that stakeholders supported from the STRAT proposal, and gives RDRRs further ability to set market prices. Then last but not least, for management of storage resources during tight system conditions, the California ISO proposes no additional storage changes considered in this initiative. There was since the straw proposal, the final proposal for the resource adequacy enhancements was proposed and released. And in that initiative is discussions on the minimum state of charge constraint proposal and other elements that can be implemented for resource adequacy by summer 2021. So I believe that's the last slide before we get into the next topic. We can pause for questions and feedback.
Okay. So if you do have a question, you can raise your hand by pressing pound 2, and just a reminder to introduce yourself first. So Kira, let me know if anybody enters the queue, please.
We do have a few questions in the queue. Once you hear your notification when your line is unmuted, please state your name, affiliation, and question. Let's move to the first caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Sorry to start us off on just a small tangent, but I think it's important related to summer. For the Order 831 emergency tariff filing changes that went in last week, is the ISO planning to do a stakeholder call or update on kind of the implications for that heading into summer? I saw there was some information in the release user group, but it didn't seem to be completely up to date, or if that was going to be the only place you'd be covering it.
Hi, this is Guillermo.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I can tell you that we're expecting to discuss this more comprehensively in the ROC meeting that is scheduled for tomorrow morning, so we can provide more detail as needed in that session. That is me, where the participants that are closer to the implementation can understand better the implications of the change. If that forum may not provide all the sufficient information, we can assess if we need to have other type of discussion.
Okay. Thanks for that update, Guillermo. Look forward to the RUG call tomorrow, and then I guess we can follow up from there. I think the main questions were just kind of around the gap in between March and June and the two different implementations and kind of what the market should be expecting there. But I'll look forward to the RUG call tomorrow, and thanks for the answer.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Go to the next question, please.
Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead. Caller, your device may be on mute.
Oh, hi. This is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yes, thank you.
Oh. So this is a follow-up to Dan's question, and again, sorry to derail. I had the same question, but I didn't quite understand, Guillermo, what you said in the beginning about something you won't know until tomorrow, and you'll follow up with more information then. Can you just repeat what you said to Dan in the beginning? Something about a call tomorrow?
Yes, tomorrow we have the scheduled ROC meeting, and we're expecting to provide more details. There was some preliminary information provided last time, but now after the information that we have, we can elaborate more on the nuances of what we have done with this last request. And there is a scheduled ROC meeting that happens every other Tuesday.
Okay, thanks. So the last time I sent people to the RUG meeting, I told WPTF members about it, and then at the RUG meeting, no one from policy was there, and you weren't available. And I'm wondering if this time you can make sure to have someone from policy and from legal at that RUG call,
Carrie,
because if that's the only opportunity, that would be really helpful.
Carrie, this is Anna. I appreciate that. I'm sorry, this is Anna. I appreciate that, and I do know that last time there was a little bit of confusion on communication of deadlines, but we'll make sure for tomorrow's RUG meeting that that is taken care of.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Let's move to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Good morning. This is Elvis Svoboda from PG&E. I just wanted to ask whether any possible implementation on the storage would require a tariff change, or is the way this is being phrased, assuming that anything that's done this summer will not require such a change?
This is James. So there are no policy proposals within the umbrella of this initiative that are for storage that require a tariff change. We are discussing in this initiative the minimum state of charge requirement as part of sort of our overall summer 2021 readiness, but that is part of the RA enhancements, and that does require a tariff change, but we sort of consider it under the umbrella of RA enhancement.
Okay, but if that were to be changed for this summer, the timeline for it would be that such a change would be made in a timely fashion, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I mean, we should see the tariff change relatively soon if that was going to be done for the summer.
Hey, Alva, this is Gabe Murtaugh. Yeah, you're correct about that. We're currently coordinating on when we can release that updated tariff language, so you should be seeing that shortly. But you're absolutely right. In order to get these changes in and approved by FERC, we do need to get moving on that very soon.
Okay, thank you very much.
Kira, how many more do we have in the queue?
At this time, we have no more questions in the queue.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, James,
okay.
Back to you.
Okay. This is James again, and I will lead the discussion on export, load, and wheeling priorities. So let's start here on slide 14. So last summer's events and the root cause analysis led the California ISO to reanalyze and rediscuss the implications of our market scheduling priorities and looking at the relative priorities of California ISO balancing area load relative to exports from outside the California ISO balancing area, or two, I should have said. We hope that this proposed set of policy changes finds the right balance between reliably serving California ISO load and providing comparable treatment and open access to what we can call high priority exports, or those exports that are supported by non-RA capacity within the CAISO and contracted with to serve load outside the CAISO, and also wheel through self-schedules. We are also looking to build upon the emergency BPM changes that we made last September to use RUC schedules as the basis for tagging and distinguishing scheduling priorities going into the real-time market. And the proposed changes here go further than the straw proposal did in leveraging the RUC process. Next slide, please. So first I'll walk through, this is a slide that we had in our straw proposal, but it's helpful to level set our definitions here. When we're talking about PT exports, that stands for price taker. These are self-scheduled exports that have that designate a supporting resource in their bid that has sufficient non-RA generation bid into the market. An LPT export is a lower price taker export. It is distinguished from a PT export because it does not designate a supporting resource with sufficient non-RA generation bid in the market for their self-schedule. An economic export is any export with an economic bid. And then a RUC export is any export deemed physically feasible in the residual unit commitment, or RUC process. Next slide, please. So for some additional background as we think about these proposals, Today, our market software determines priority order in which various types of self-schedules are curtailed using market parameters known as penalty prices. We want to emphasize that when we say same scheduling priority, what that implies is the penalty prices will be the same in the market software, but it does not guarantee that if there are curtailments that occur between these schedule types, that they would be curtailed equally due to other factors like congestion and losses. So we do want to make that clear. We also want to, as background, describe that we recognize there, in light of this process, there are gaps in how we validate. Their designated resource has sufficient non-RA capacity participating in the market to support an export. Currently, today, it's not re-verified in real time, although that is something that we propose to change. That's an improvement we plan to make. Today, the validation process only compares a resource's upper economic limit, or the maximum output of the resource bid into the market, to its designated RA showing, in which stakeholders have brought up concerns about that validation approach, of which we've attempted to put together some attestation rules that hopefully get us most of the way there in addressing those concerns. We also note, as I said earlier in the stakeholder comments, that our current validation approach does not consider outages or commitment status or deliverability. And when we were looking at changes that we were wanting to make to the validation process, we were hoping to leverage our existing process as much as possible because changes to these validation rules require really complex interactions between different software systems. And we found that, any validation proposal that strayed too much from the existing process would be too complicated for the summer, except for the change that we're making where we are revalidating the resource in real time. So that should be an improvement there. Next slide, please. So here are the market's current scheduling priorities. First, in the day-ahead market, I'll talk about the self-scheduled wheel priorities, which currently have scheduling priority above both PT exports and load. We talked a little bit about this in the straw proposal and in the Market Surveillance Committee a few weeks ago, that essentially the reason why is that the self-scheduled wheel has two legs to the transaction. It has the import leg and the export leg, and both of the import and the export leg have a penalty price associated with violating the self-schedule that, when combined together, essentially create a super priority of the self-scheduled wheel. So we are proposing some changes to that process. Today, PT exports and load have the same scheduling priority in the day-ahead market, followed by LPT exports, and then economic exports and economic wheels. In the real-time market, the self-scheduled wheels continue to have the same or highest priority for the same reasons that I just mentioned. Today, any export that is deemed feasible in RUC has the highest or has a higher real-time market scheduling priority than newly submitted PT exports or California ISO load, followed by LPT exports and economic exports and wheels. Next slide, please. So we're proposing a couple changes from the straw proposal. In the straw proposal, like I mentioned earlier, we had proposed that PT exports have higher priority than load, and wheel-through self-schedules have lower priority than load in the day-ahead and real-time markets. In this draft final proposal, we are proposing that those three schedules have equal market priority in IFM, RUC, and the real-time market. And we hope that provides a better balance between the stakeholder comments on that. We have introduced two attestation rules, which would become tariff rules, that, like I said earlier, our intention is, to try to get us as far as we can in addressing some of the concerns around the validation, our current validation rules. So our first tariff rule proposed is that if a scheduling coordinator allows its resource to be designated to support an export, it is affirming that the resource is in fact contracted by the exporter. And also a second tariff rule in which the scheduling coordinator will attest that the resource is currently capable to support an hourly block schedule in the operating hour equal to the PT export quantity. And so this works in coordination with a master file flag that we will put in which the default option is that they know for both of these attestations, and by attesting, the scheduling coordinator is affirming that the resource is capable and contracted, capable to meet its schedule and contracted. We are proposing in the draft final proposal that the designated resource must participate in RUC, and this would happen, the portion of the RUC bid up to the PT export quantity would be submitted at $0 per megawatt, and the portion of the RUC bid above the PT export quantity will be at the RUC bid price. We want to have designated resources participating in RUC so they are considered equally with RA resources and meeting our export and load, which makes up the California ISO demand. We also want resources participating in designated resources participating in RUC because today, if they don't receive an IFM schedule, then there is no sort of offer obligation into the real-time market. And we do want those resources offering. We also are proposing that those designated resources will be required to bid 0 up to their PT export quantity because RUC exports are, RUC costs are allocated to load, and we wouldn't want designated exports bidding super high so they're not picked up, they're not scheduled in the RUC process if they're needed. Next slide, please. So we're confirming that PT status in real time can be provided in two different ways. First, it would be the lower of the designated resources RUC schedule or the day-ahead exports RUC schedule. The California ISO will automatically generate bids for RUC awards. PT status can also be firmed up in real time if a designated resource bids into the real-time market in excess of its RUC award. We did provide a table in the draft final proposal that hopefully clarified some of those rules. Now, if a designated resource does not receive a RUC award, the scheduling coordinator must rebid the export in the real-time market to maintain its PT priority. And that goes back to sort of wanting those must offer obligation type rules for those designated resources into the real-time market. Next slide, please. So here's a summary of changes from the draft proposal to our real-through scheduling priorities. In the straw proposal, we proposed that wheel-through schedules would receive LPT or comparable to LPT export priority. And in our draft final proposal, we're proposing they receive equivalent to PT export priority. We are continuing to propose that these wheels no longer receive the highest priority based on how their import and export penalty prices work together. And we are planning a stakeholder initiative in which we will look to develop a process for suppliers to procure or to forward procure their wheel-through transmission capacity, while at the same time ensuring we have enough transmission capability to access our RA imports. Now, if there are self-scheduled imports, California ISO load will be met over a wheel-through self-schedule based on the added cost to the objective function of relaxing the import self-schedule at its penalty price. And we'll walk through a couple examples in these slides and provided some additional context on these examples in our draft final proposal appendix. Next slide. So here are our proposed scheduling priorities. In the day-ahead market and in the real-time market, you'll see PT exports, load, and self-scheduled wheels will have the same penalty prices in the day-ahead market, followed by LPT exports and economic exports and wheels. In the real-time market, for that second category, those REC exports, either that in the day-ahead market were submitted as LPT or economic, and then confirmed in the REC process, or they could be PT exports submitted in the day-ahead market that had lost access to their designated resource. Those would go in at the second highest priority there in the category REC export without GEN, followed by LPT exports and economic exports and economic wheels. Next slide. So these examples come from the appendix that we put together on this topic, and I'll walk through an example of how the wheel and wheel priority and the load scheduling priority interacts in HASP. Since wheels are hourly block schedules, HASP will determine their real-time schedules. So here's a list of the current and proposed, in one case, penalty prices for each of these schedules or constraints. So we need to review these so that the examples on the next slide make sense. So for new LPT exports submitted in the real-time market, they have an associated penalty price of $11.50. New PT exports submitted in the real-time market have a penalty price of $14.50. Today, any RUC export has a penalty price of $1,800, but those RUC exports with generation, in which we are revalidating the supply in real time, that's changing to $14.50 to be equal to load. Violating the power balance constraint in excess of 300 megawatts of regulation has an associated penalty price of $14.50. In this case, because the examples don't include under 300 megawatts of regulation, that we don't need to consider that one. For RUC self-scheduled import scheduled to be curtailed, that has an associated penalty price of negative $750. And then for a real-time self-scheduled import not related to a RUC schedule, or not associated with any RUC schedule, has a penalty price of negative $400. Next slide. So hopefully we wrote those down or can refer to them when we're going over these examples. So first bullet there, if a RUC import self-schedule is needed to meet the CAISO load forecast, the cost of not meeting load is $2,200, which is the $14.50 from the PT export priority, plus the negative $7.50 from the RUC self-scheduled import priority. The cost of the wheel is $14.50. Therefore, the load will be served before any RUC or real-time wheel. If a real-time import self-schedule is needed to meet the CAISO load forecast, the cost of not meeting the load is $18.50, which is the combined penalty price of the PT export, the combined penalty price of violating the power balance constraint with the penalty price of not meeting the real-time import schedule. The cost of the wheel, again, is $14.50, and therefore load will be served in this case before any RUC or real-time wheel. Now, if a real-time import that economically bids less than $0, let's say -10, is needed to meet the CAISO load forecast, the cost of not meeting load is $14.60, which is the power balance constraint penalty price plus the -$10 bid. The cost of the wheel is $14.50, and then therefore the load will be served before any RUC or real-time wheel. Finally, if a real-time import that economically bids greater than $0, let's say $20, is needed to meet the CAISO load forecast, the cost of not meeting load is $14.30, which is the power balance constraint cost minus $20. The cost of the wheel is again $14.50. So then the RUC or real-time wheel will be served before California ISO load. So that's the end of the slides for load and export and wheeling priorities. We can open it up to for stakeholder questions and discussion.
Great, thank you. So again, you can press #2 to raise your hand.
We have several questions in the queue. Let's go to the first caller. Caller, your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Good morning, James and Anna and Mark. James, I'm wondering, it's Mark Holman with PowerX. I'm wondering if you could just back up to slide 21. I appreciate the opening comments and the transparency being provided here, but I wanted to walk through a little bit some of the outcomes we think we might see here, which provide illustration of what will happen, we think, when we get to the summer season and get to the critical hours, particularly the AAH hours or 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. when there are challenges under high load conditions meeting load in California and the Southwest. So if we could just, looking at this, you don't have the IFM here, but maybe I can talk through some examples. So the wheel self-schedule is really a combination of a self-scheduled import and a self-scheduled export that is linked together in the software as I understand it. And the self-scheduled load has to be served by something. So when the software has import congestion, really want to compare the outcomes through the different market time frames. When you have import congestion and you have a self-scheduled wheel and you have a self-scheduled import seeking to serve either the CAISO's load forecast in the Hasper real time or self-scheduled load in the IFM. And I appreciate the transparency and the examples here, but I think the part I'm struggling with is on a wheel, why the import leg of a self-scheduled wheel would effectively be at $0 instead of the same level as a self-scheduled import serving load within the CAISO BA. And I think that is best to walk through examples just to talk it through. So if we think about the IFM first, and let's think about the Pacific DC line and forward contracts where you have entity A that has forward supply and firm transmission to get to knob. They've offered their supply in the forward market, and they've contracted with someone in the Southwest. And they've secured that contract on a forward basis, and when we get to these critical hours, they then self-schedule a wheel. At the same time, we have entity B in the IFM who has sold forward power to an LSE inside the CAISO BAA, and the CAISO BAA is purchasing that at the border and self-scheduling that power as an import and also self-scheduling their load. So you have two different interests there. You have the Desert Southwest wanting to meet their resource adequacy needs via purchasing Northwest supply at Knob. You have a LSE inside the CAISO BAA wanting to meet their resource adequacy needs through a purchase of supply at Knob, and they're both self-scheduling. I think it's correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in the IFM, because I didn't see that in the paper, will this give priority to the load in the LSE and the CAISO BAA when you have import congestion at Knob? Will the load serving entity in the CAISO get priority to their deliveries at Knob from entity B, and the wheel through will be not awarded?
Hey, Mark, thanks for your question. This is James, and before answering that specific question at the end, I just want to confirm that you are questioning, our current proposal is to set the import leg of a wheel to $0 in the market, and that is because we're trying to give the wheel-through transaction as a whole equal priority to PT exports and load, and you are wondering why not set that import leg to something comparable to the bottom two schedule or constraint penalty prices here, that negative 750 or negative 400. Is that the overall theme of the question?
Yeah, I want to be very, very respectful of the load serving entity and the CAISO as a balancing authority area having a need to serve its load. I'm not suggesting in any way that the wheel through get higher priority, and if it currently has higher priority, I don't think that is right. I think what I'm flagging here is what you've just described, and I want to walk through these examples because this is what concerns us, is that you have to look at both. The software will clear both. So if the software sees CAISO load self-scheduled in the IFM, and the only way it can serve it is through more imports, and the imports are self-scheduled at Knob and it's constrained, and you have a wheel that has similar desire to serve load in the Southwest, it doesn't seem that they're being treated equally. And I don't think I think it's accurate, but I don't think it tells the full story to say the wheel through is getting the same priority as load, because the wheel through is two things. It's a self-scheduled import and a self-scheduled export, and that self-scheduled load is going to get matched up potentially with a self-scheduled import, and your current proposal is going to give priority to serving load in the CAISO BAA over that wheel through trying to serve load in the Southwest.
Thanks, Mark. I think I understand your question, and I hopefully have explained why our current. Let me just reiterate, and I said it in the beginning, just the mechanics again for more context for listeners, the mechanics again of the wheel through self-schedule today, where because they involve two legs of this transaction, the market penalty prices considers both the cost of the penalty price to curtail the export part of the transaction and the import part of the transaction together, sort of creating like I called it, a super priority. And our proposal was to set the import portion of $0 so that the market only sees the export part of the self-schedule curtailment, in which case the penalty prices are similar. I would ask others to jump in on the consequences of. Go ahead.
James, this is Khalid. I just want to give probably a quick, without going into too much details, but I would like to distinguish between the two scenarios. The first one with the wheel, yes, there is a self-schedule import and there is a self-schedule export, but there is an additional balance equation that is balancing the import equal to the export, and that one also has priority. So the proposal is actually to make sure that we are treating this scenario of the wheel similar to the other imports that we are getting to serve the load. What we are trying to avoid is the case where the import for the wheel is getting a higher priority than any other imports or even the load. And by putting zero, Mark, we are actually, because we have this other equation that links the import to the export, so the import is still protected. It is $0 just to make sure that it is not an additional protection, but because of the balance between import and export for the wheel, it's still protected with the export penalty. So if we want to cut the imports, we have to cut the export because of that balancing. For the case of the ISO load, yes, the import is, it's a self-schedule, but there is no connection between, this import and the ISO load. It is just an independent bid, I would say, that is put there, and we use it like any other supply in the system. So this way, we, by having the penalty or the protection of this self-scheduled import and compare it to the zero of the wheel, but because of the other penalty that this import of the wheel is getting, then both of these are on the same, same treatment. And at the end, we have achieved that if we run into an extreme condition, like you said, then we know for sure that our import capacity for the California ISO balancing area is not consumed by wheeling through the area, which will basically would not allow us to import anything to serve our own load. So we're not trying to.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think your last statement's the critical one, is that I understand they're not linked, but I think in practice, what is going to happen here is when the CAISO BAA is deficient, it has more bid-in load, or in the HAS process or FMM, the CAISO forecast load has more than the resources available. The CAISO load will get priority access to imports at Knob and Cobb over the Southwest, who have also seeking supply at Cobb and Knob to meet their resource adequacy needs. And I think we just need to be clear about how it's going to play out.
Mark, I think, this is Anna, I think you're right that it's going to play out that way, that it's going to get the lesser priority because of the wheeling constraint that we have to enforce. But I don't know if the characterization that it's going to, the import is going to be beating out the import to serve the load outside of the system is a one-to-one analogy, because the wheel is materially different than an import is to the ISO. So I think that, it's certainly true that it will be treated differently as a result of that additional constraint. But I think what we're trying to say is that they don't necessarily do and perform and impact the system the same way. And we have, and we will continue to honor that if somebody schedules a wheel through, that will maintain the integrity of the import and export balance for that schedule, and we'll consider what that does, how that impacts our system. So I don't think we're trying to say that those will be treated differently. What we're trying to say is that they will be treated differently if they are coming to us that way, and that's just the way it works. However, because of the wheeling constraints. However, if there's two imports coming in, and there's no difference if an import is coming to the ISO without the additional constraint, those two imports will be treated equally the same. It's how people choose to structure their deals that might impact how it works out in the market. And the other thing I wanted to say is, I think and folks know that we don't have a lengthy transmission reservation process ahead of time in the ISO market, and that because of that, it certainly affords participants a certain degree of flexibility to wheel through. And we're not looking to take that away right now, given that is our paradigm where we don't have transmission reservation requirements. But at the same time, we are trying to ensure that imports and wheel-throughs, based on how they impact the system, that they are treated fairly. So I just want to make that distinction because I don't think it's true to say that they're going to be competing on an unequal basis, given that they're differently situated.
I understand your comment, and I was just trying to make sure I understand that the IFM was not laid out, and this is providing some clarity. I do think that our concerns remain that when we get into those critical hours, and I appreciate the CAISO's providing wheeling service, and this doesn't affect anything in the vast majority of hours, but when we get to those critical hours where there may not be enough supply to serve CAISO load and serve load in the Southwest, and there are forward transactions being self-scheduled as wheel-throughs at NOB and at COB, and there are self-scheduled imports at COB and NOB, it seems that what's being confirmed is that the import serving CAISO load will get prioritized and the wheels will be the first out because the import leg will be treated at 0, the export leg at 1450, and the combination of the import to serve CAISO load will get priority. And I understand the challenge here, but it is giving priority, and that will extend even when that import is on non-firm bondable transmission, even if it's not an RA transaction, even if it's just an LSE choosing to purchase in the spot market to import. And I think that's going to extend into the HAS process, that when the CAISO exceptionally dispatches supply in the Northwest at COB or NOB, that too will go in as a self-scheduled import and clear against the CAISO's load forecast. And when we're in those critical hours, I think that will cause wheels to get curtailed. And so I want to make sure our concerns are clear, which is in those very critical hours, if the goal is to provide equal priority and allow load in the Southwest to have equal priority access to COB and NOB supply as CAISO load, and provide a mechanism to do that, recognizing and very respectful that you don't have the time to develop a forward transmission procurement framework, I don't think this proposal does it. I think this proposal very clearly, for any imports that come in below $0, including self-scheduled, when we're in those crunch conditions and the import intertie is full, the CAISO load will get priority over wheel-throughs and over individual import and export legs. And if I'm misunderstanding that, I just want to please clarify, but it seems that that's what this is doing. It's saying you're on equal priority until the CAISO load hits a power balance, and we have imports filling the tie that are below $0, then the CAISO load will get priority.
Hi, Mark. This is George Angelidis. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, George.
Just one interjection here. I'm going to go back to what Khalid said earlier. Because there is no link that we have in the software between an import and the load actually has the ability to be served by other imports on other interties that or even you have inputs on other ties that they have still economic beds. We're trying to focus on a tie that there is congestion. And we're comparing, on one hand, an import self-schedule, just an import on its own, and a wheel that goes through that intertie, and they compete for transmission capacity on a congested intertie. Yes, let's leave the load out. The load can be served by another intertie or whatever. So between those two structures, an independent import, an independent and a connected import, we compete for transmission capacity. We wanted to give these two constructs the same scheduling priority. So on one side, we have the independent import as a self-schedule that has its own scheduling priority, and on the other side, we have a wheel trying to give it the scheduling priority of the export, who competes equally for getting transmission capacity, right? So this was our focus here.
I understand what you said, George, and again, I understand the challenging situation the CAISO's in, trying to strike a balance here. I'm struggling with the one detail of, if we're trying to give load in both regions equal priority to supply coming from the Northwest, for example, at Cobb and Knob, I'm not seeing how these penalty prices at all achieve that. It seems to be, once we get into that crunch situation, self-scheduled imports serving CAISO load get priority on the CAISO grid, on the transmission to get to the CAISO. They will get to flow ahead of wheel-throughs in those critical hours. And if we want to give them equal priority, again, want to be very respectful of the fact that you only have so much time, so not asking for a more complex solution, but it seems to us that the wheel penalty price should be set equal in each market time frame to the import self-scheduled penalty price plus the power balance self-schedule or self-scheduled price or power balance price. And that seems to be what achieves that. This seems to say, once the tie fills with supply that is below $0 and that supply is needed, so you've exhausted the other ties, the load will get served first with those imports clearing ahead of the wheel. And I think, and I'm just trying to confirm, that's even if the wheel has cleared in the IFM. If new self-schedules come in as imports against the CAISO's load forecast, and those are needed to meet that load forecast, that can displace previously awarded wheels. That's our current understanding. If that's incorrect, we'd love to hear clarification.
So, Mark, this is Khalid. I just want to clarify. I would like us to focus. What we are saying is on a particular intertie. We would like to treat the self-schedule imports, whether it is for a wheel or whether it is for, serve other purpose. We would like to treat them equally. Currently, we have an issue that one of those, which is the import for the wheel, is getting higher priority than the other imports, self-schedule imports on that same intertie. And the reason for that is that wheel is connected through a balance equation with an export. So the protection of that self-schedule wheel is double the protection of the regular import. That's all what we are saying. We have not extended, because of the time, like you said, we did not extend it into load and other stuff, but we are trying to match the priority of the self-schedule import wheel with the self-schedule for other purposes. And that's by putting zero, so let's assume the penalty is X, let's say $1,000 penalty, then currently the import for the wheel is getting protected by 1,000. The regular import, independent self-schedule import is 1,000. And the export, let's say, is another 1,000. I'm just using, simple numbers. So the self-import wheel is protected by 2,000 because it is the 1,000 of the import and 1,000 of the export, versus the other imports are only protected by 1,000. That's all what we are saying. We are only addressing this problem.
That's helpful, Khaled. I actually understand what you're getting at now. That's helpful in the sense that you're concerned about the linked equation giving the wheel currently priority over imports when there is no power balance. So priority for economic displacement, for example. That makes sense to me. I think our concern is, though, is that in doing that, what is then happening is when you get into a power balance, the import leg to serve CAISO load, when you're in that circumstance, that import leg is now getting priority over the wheel in those critical hours. So that was actually really helpful, Khaled, to explain your concern about the wheel getting priority, what I would call under more normal conditions. But I think this change has the perhaps unintended consequence of now giving imports to serve CAISO load priority over wheels, including even new imports that could come in real time, such as exceptional dispatch, and could kick wheels out in the circumstance of you having a power balance. So I appreciate the clarity. We can maybe talk offline and give some numeric examples. That was helpful. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mark. We'll go to the next question, please. We have 6 in the queue. Is that correct, Kira?
We are at 5 now.
5, okay.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I have 2 questions and a quick comment. The first one is I was reading the draft proposal, not the presentation, and it talked about an attestation with the master file flag. And I was concerned that by putting by clicking the flag that the CAISO was saying that the resource would be attesting that it was available for block hourly schedules whenever anyone chose to pick that resource. And I'm wondering if you could give some more clarification around that, because some contracts, for example, are contracts by hours, for only 8 hours a day or for 5 days a week. And then sometimes a resource just might not be available. So I'm wondering how a static master file flag, how you're expecting resources to use that as kind of a blanket attestation.
So Gary, this is Don. So I think what we're trying to do is we want to, that's really how we implement sort of that it's a contracted resource. That, in my mind, is something that's like a master file type, feature that, you're not entering into a contract, 15 minutes prior to when bids are submitted into the CAISO market. And so what we wanted to do is to have those resources use the master file flag and basically set the default to that you cannot be a designated supporting resource. And then when the resource elects to change that master file flag, then it is, in essence, saying it can be a designated supporting resource and can meet those attestation rules. Now, we don't have the ability to go validate all of those attestation rules, but again, it's just a way to recognize that it really is sort of it is more of a static feature as to whether or not you've been contracted, and so that's why we felt the master file was a good way to do that.
I see.
This is George. Just to add to it, the fact that you set this flag to yes, meaning that you attest that you can support the resource, that does not obligate you to bid in the market. It's not a must-offer obligation. This simply says that when the resource is available and bids in the market, it can support an export self-schedule, and we will validate that. If the resource is not available or in the market, I'm assuming it's not, and it doesn't submit a bid, obviously if an export self-schedule designates that resources supporting resource, it will fail a validation and won't give the export PT priority. But the flag does not really put an obligation to the resource to bid. It just says that if the resource is bidding and it's in the market, then it can support an export self-schedule.
Yeah. thanks. I do understand that. It's more that sometimes they have a contract for some days of the week or some hours and not all hours. So I just wanted to make sure that that nuance was understood by the CAISO, especially some of the older resources that have the longer-term contracts, because they could attest to that maybe during peak hours, for example, it could support an export, but during other times it won't have that contract. And if you guys really do want to say you have to have a contract, then I think it should be acknowledged that the contract sometimes isn't a 24/7 contract.
No, and that's fine, Carrie, because again, the export still has to identify the resource in its hourly bid that it's being used for that purpose. And we will also looking to add a feature where we will notify the scheduling coordinator of the resource anytime they've been designated.
Oh, excellent. Okay, yeah, I think that notification will be completely helpful to close that, three-party loop. Okay, so then the next question I had is, are you guys still going to use the upper economic limit, or has that been scrapped completely? To do the check, to do any sort of check, or are you guys not going to do that? There's a lot of discussion on that, and I don't see that.
So this is going to be in place. We're still looking at the upper limit of the bid for the IFM, this energy bid is used in IFM, and we'll take into account other considerations as well. If there is providing ancillary services, we're taking that from the top, like contingency reserve, things like that. But we are planning to expand this also in RAC by saying that if the resource is supporting export self-schedules, that support should carry through IFM and into RAC, and the mechanism to do that is make sure that the resource is also in RAC, and as James mentioned earlier in his presentation, needs to bid at $0, so we want to array resources in RAC by calculating and putting. Yes?
Yeah, I understood all that, George. I just had a very specific question about the upper economic limit. You said, for example, that you're going to take it from the top, but I had a question about partial RA resources. If you take the AS from the top, it sounds like you're going to take that away from the non-RA portion. And I'm wondering if you had considered whether that makes sense or not.
I don't have this information right now at my fingertip. To see ancillary service help provision is taken off for partial array resources if it is taken off from the non-array capacity in the market or the array capacity in the market. But as you know, array resources, they do have an obligation also to be in the market. So it would make sense to consider the sub-provision of ancillary services as part of the array capacity, and we do that in RAC actually. So it would make sense to not take it from the non-array capacity, but I don't have the rule to confirm that.
I was the rules are the other way around, but it sounds like the intent of the policy is to take it from the non-RA portion, or is the intent of the policy to take it from the RA portion?
I'll have to look and get back to you on this. I don't remember right now.
Terry, this is Don. Yeah. We are aware that there's some issues around partial RA, that's an added complexity, and we're looking at that. But it really does make it very complex. And if we were going to, we've got on our roadmap, for instance, joint ownership units, where we wanted to deal with all of these complexities in terms of dealing with RA in that initiative. So it's a lot of complex interactions that we need to look at. And so I think we were looking to.
Yeah, I'm not pushing for one way or the other. I'm just looking for information on how it's going to be done this summer.
Yeah. So I think the key is
no criticism here, information
as close as what it's done, as close as what it is today.
I see. Okay, that makes sense to me. And then finally, just an ask based on the discussion you just had with PowerX. So on slide 17, you say that PT exports load and wheel-throughs have the same market priority and IFM, RUC, and RTM. I would say that you're giving them the same penalty parameter, but, per that discussion, they don't have the same market priority, and that's fairly misleading. Again, WPTF doesn't have an official position on this, and we're really pleased with the direction that this initiative has gone. We think really you've just done a great job. But so our just big push right now is let's just be really transparent. We understand compromises have to be made, but I think this is a big compromise that obviously some people are less pleased with or more pleased with. And I just feel like that first bullet is pretty misleading. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. We'll go to the next question, please.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, it's Mark with Calpine. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Mark. Go ahead.
Good. Hi. Good morning. I just want to follow up on Carrie's question just a little bit. I guess, why wouldn't a master file tell you whether a resource can meet an hourly block schedule? Alternatively, what resource could not meet an hourly block schedule?
So this is Don. I would say a variable energy resource that's moving around on a 5-minute basis is not providing you 12 5-minute intervals at the same level.
And don't you know from the master file what the resource type is? And so why does somebody have to attest to that, I guess? It's just a point of clarification.
No, so I agree we know the resource type. But again, we were trying to, put that flag in place. But again, the default is that it's set to no, that you can't be a designated resource. And then we would expect only the resources that truly have contracted and have hourly block capability would, turn that flag on.
Okay, so any fully dispatchable up or down resource could just flag that it can meet an hourly schedule. Okay, I guess I get that. Thank you.
Sarah, how many more do we have in the queue?
We have 4 callers in the queue.
Okay.
Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Good morning, it's Dave Francis at DTE Energy Trading. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, hi, Dave.
Hi, I may have missed in some of the previous discussions, but where can I find the description and the formulas for how whatever we're calling them, RUC awards or RUC schedules for exports are calculated and allocated?
Hi, Dave, this is Guillermo. I think the question is not that simple. There is no predefined formula. It's part of the optimization that takes into account all the economics of the system, all the constraints of the system and the resources to come with the optimal dispatch. It's a value derived from the optimization problem.
Well, I'm not sure I appreciate that answer. At the end of IFM, especially in a scenario where convergence bidding has been suspended, if there's an export award, it's had a higher effective price than any unawarded load, right? And it would include congestion constraints. So at the end of IFM, if there's an export that's been awarded, it's been accounted for. So why would it not have a 100% RUC award or RUC schedule at the end of RUC?
Yeah, because when you are pointing to the differences between IFM and RUC, when we go into RUC, even though we have similar resources in RUC available, we don't have the bidding demand. Now it's replaced with the forecast. We don't have convergence bids. It's convergence bids per suspended. Yeah, it's not a factor. But there are variations between IFM and RUC. And on top of that, we have different penalty prices. The priorities, the relative priorities are preserved. But basically, you're solving, again, a new optimization problem, a new market clearing process, and that naturally is going to put you in a different situation. So as simple as changing the bidding demand against the forecast, now you are going to be clearing against a different value. And if the value is lower or higher, you may have to incrementally dispatch resources in RAC in comparison to IFM.
I'm still not sure I follow you that if at the end of the IFM, transmission is accounted for, supply is accounted for, the exports accounted for, loads accounted for, and RUC is then going to get the difference in the CAISO's forecast and the cleared demand. That sounds like a capacity issue, but so are you reprioritizing unawarded demand over an awarded export at that point?
The relative priorities remain largely the same between IFM and RAC. What is changing is your target point. If the economics in IFM tell you that you could clear 35,000 megawatts of load, and now you have a load forecast that is different, higher or lower, the solution is going to be different because now your target point is different.
Well, how is it different if the load forecast is lower? I don't think that's the problem. But if the load forecast is higher, CAISO's forecast is higher than cleared demand, cleared load, you're going to get that capacity. Why does that reduce with it already cleared exports? If Guillermo, if it's easier to do this offline, I'd be glad to do that.
Yeah, I think, this is Khalid, I think you're assuming that the IFM, the bid and load in the IFM cleared similar to the load forecast. The load forecast that...
No, I'm not. I'm not at all. I'm not at all. I'm assuming that the load that cleared in the IFM cleared based on the bids submitted by load.
Correct. And they submit them based on what they think their forecast will be. The forecast that is used in RAC is the ISO forecast. So regardless of what the forecast that the IUs or the load bid and load came, based on whatever assumption the FT for that bid and load assumed, then when we go to RAC, we use the ISO load forecast.
Right. So what I'm asking is, if load bid at $100 and the clearing price was $500, it was uncleared. A self-scheduled export is a bid effectively at $1,450. Are you telling me that you're not awarding an export now so that you can award load in real time and therefore giving load that was bid at $100 a $1,451 effective price?
I'm not sure. Maybe, like you said, maybe we can take this offline in an example that you could, show us exactly what.
I've been asking for a while. If you'll check with Brad Cooper and some of those guys, I've got it. So let me just ask something that would help. You guys have been reluctant in the past. So you have bundled historical information on the amount of exports that were awarded in IFM and then the amount of REC schedules or work awards that were allocated to those exports. I'm not looking for individual bids. I'm looking for it in its totality. Can you make that information available?
It's currently available on OASIS. You can check it there.
Yeah.
I can see on REC schedules for exports.
Exports and imports at the system level.
Yeah, imports and exports. I'm looking for the REC schedules for imports and exports. I'm looking for the IFM award of exports and then the corresponding REC schedule REC award for exports.
Yeah, they're on OASIS.
If they will be there, and RUC will, that's part of the RUC. The only difference, if you will see in, between the exports in RUC and the exports in IFM, if there is any curtailment of those exports in RUC, which will be the low priority export, by the way, because the high priority ones or the PT ones are treated with the same penalty or same protection as the load in RUC. So to the extent that we have any curtailment in the low priority exports, you will see that posted as well.
All right, I'll go review the OASIS data. And then just a final comment and I'll get off the line. If you guys would make a concerted effort to publish a full list of the effective penalty prices as soon as possible and then update that periodically as they change, that would be great.
Yeah. I think, yeah, the plan is to put it in the PPM as well. Guillermo, correct?
Yes, and let me clarify. There is largely the parent space already listed there. What we're going to be doing is the true up of the ones that are missing. But parent space are already listed in the PPM. We just have to make sure that it's consistently showing the ones that we are off. That is a few ones. And the second comment, Dave, you can go to Oasis, choose the tab of energy, and then pick the option of system load. And then you can choose whether you want to see IFM, ROC, HASP, or real time. The information is there and has been there for a while.
Right. I think the question I'm asking is not there, but I'll look and then send a note. Thanks, guys.
Sure.
Okay, Kiara, we have 3 more left in the queue.
Yes, let's go to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Partha Malvankar with PG&E. I had a few questions and one comment. Maybe my comment I'd like to start off with is just in terms of the overall scope. I'd like to just comment that I think that these exports of wheeling priority topics are really critical, particularly within the CAISO's BA function for summer reliability. And that particularly there's a number of the other topics where I don't necessarily see as direct of a link to helping summer reliability. So just to some degree, to some of the comments made earlier of there's not sufficient time to get some of these additional changes in place. I'd like to encourage ISO to think about other topics that they can drop that might not have as material of an impact. So that's my comment. My first question is, has the CAISO done any research in terms of what other RTOs do and or other BAs in the West in terms of prioritizing exports and wheeling transactions relative to serving internal load? Based on our initial research, we basically identified no RTOs that would prioritize an hourly wheeling product above serving load in their area, and that the only way you get a comparable priority, and they almost all are following the NERC TLR procedures associated with the only way to get that comparable priority would be to basically commit and pay for a year plus of service and to be studied for reliability. So like, I was just going to see, like, has the ISO done any comparison to these other RTOs? And if so, were their findings different than mine?
Yeah, hey, Partha, this is Brad Cooper. Yeah, we're doing that research. It's still a work in process, but the issue we're finding out, and you know, this kind of relates to the discussion with PowerX, is a lot of the other, or most of the other surrounding BAAs, they have a different paradigm. So they limit, for example, wheels. They could limit the amount of transmission they make available for wheels, but then again, they have a process to know what's in excess of the requirements, you know, reasonably needed to meet their resource adequacy forecast, and they can release a set amounts. You know, the quandary we are in is we don't have a process like that. We're proposing to start up a stakeholder process after the changes for this summer are complete, in which we can look at a forward process like that. But for this summer, we're trying to strike here, you know, a reasonable balance by providing open access, but then allowing us to reasonably serve our load.
Yeah, I can appreciate that, Brad. And like just my own comment back is I don't know all the. I recognize this is likely a complicated endeavor, but I think it's certainly an important topic, and to agree that there can be a year-long plus framework to commit for and pay for the transmission in order to get equal priority. To me, that would make sense as a next step, because to me this seems the CAISO's proposal from a policy perspective seems very inconsistent, at least with all the other RTOs in the market. So if the ISO is concerned about getting FERC approval on this basis, I think there's a lot of precedent in terms of using the NERC TLR priority levels in order to just determine who gets curtailed first based on commitment of service and paying for the transmission. And particularly, like I'll give the example of if there's congestion on path 15 going through CAISO, Scott Harvey gave the example of, I believe, of ISO New England and their process. And I think that these could be worthwhile examples to look at quickly. And I think that ISO should prioritize it. So, yeah, thanks, Brian.
Yeah, like I said, we're in the we've been looking at that information and we're in the process of summarizing it. But you know, the difference is that they have processes to reserve transmission ahead of the day-ahead market, where the only thing we have in place, you know, apart from CRRs, which isn't procuring firm physical transmission, all we have is the day-ahead market to do that.
No, fair enough, Brad. Thanks for the chance to comment on that. And I look forward to seeing your analysis of what these other RTOs do. My second question, and this is really maybe sort of tying into sort of the discussion on the priorities of wheels relative to RA imports. So the example that was given was basically, for lack of a better term, if an RA import bids negative $10, you know, from the penalty parameter discussion, it seems that they would have a priority above wheels. If it was positive $10, which is, you know, for lack of a better term, what we'd really expect in the markets is for participants to bid their actual cost of producing. It might be the case where wheels could actually squeeze out RA imports. So I was just wondering, sort of in light of these changes, is the ISO see a need, you know, particularly for the non-CPUC jurisdictionals, but also for resource-specific RA, to have a sell schedule or a requirement to bid a negative value in order to make sure that the CAISO BA can meet its needs?
Yeah, that's something come up, but that is a good point, because the way the priorities work out is the imports to serve California ISO aren't necessarily beating out wheels. You know, if they economically bid, they won't. It seems that in practice, the way things would usually work out would be that the RA imports are self-scheduling or bidding. I believe the dividing line is they got to bid below zero to get the priority. So in practice, it seems like it would work out generally that the use of the California ISO transmission system is being just prioritized for RA imports relative to wheels, though I would say, though, that it's a fair point that PowerX pointed out that, you know, that might be true in most circumstances, but there's nothing preventing import for load serving entities coming in and self-scheduling more imports than the RA planning target.
No, thanks, Brian. I look forward to that discussion. Maybe sort of tying the two together. I certainly think the easier way for the ISO to do this is just simply as a part of their policy and parameters to prioritize California load over the short-term wheeling transactions. But to the degree that they're going this optimization method, I do think there's more thoughts needed in terms of what the requirements look like on RA resources in order to maintain reliability. So, yeah, thank you for that. And my last question, this is maybe one just it's maybe a very similar example. So I take at least from a practical standpoint, could a PT export be sourced in Northern California, even if there's congestion over Path 15? and basically crowd out internal RA being able to serve load in Southern California?
Sorry, this is Brad. I was waiting to see if anyone else wanted to take that. It's hard when we're not in the same room and we can't look around.
And if PAP 26 is the better description, basically, for lack of a better term, if there's north to south congestion, how would that work in practice?
It is possible that the PT export could clear, and the northern import or the northern resource couldn't clear. It's possible that could occur. And also, as we said before, on the designated resources, we aren't checking for deliverability of the designated resource currently, which is why we reduced the scheduling the scheduling priority we gave them, because we couldn't do those more complex validation rules.
In other words, they're not explicitly linked. We're not delivering the PT export per se from the designated resource.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Don. Appreciate that, Brad. At least in terms of like the priority level, like that, I do think that this is sort of a key topic. You gave the example earlier of a PT export not being selected in the RUC process, so it's basically not picked up or dispatched in the RUC process. And to me, this really highlights sort of that type of example of where if we are for lack of a better term, if we're in the type of situation where it matters to be a PT export, i.e., you are basically needing that priority level not to be curtailed above load, I would have to sort of wonder, why would a resource not be committed if it wasn't for some sort of transmission constraint or other sort of limitation? So I do think that to the degree that the ISO can deprioritize some of these other topics that are coming later and focus on looking at issues like deliverability, I think that would be important in terms of achieving the goal of some reliability in California. So, yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Others do we have questions?
We have 2 more callers in the queue.
Okay.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair representing the Six Cities group. I have a question about you've talked about the wheeling schedules involving balanced imports and exports. Does that mean that if, for example, the import either doesn't show up or has to be curtailed, that the export is automatically curtailed as well?
Yes, Bonnie, the constraint is that the import schedule must equal the export schedule.
And, okay, and then in real time, so let's say, for example, because of an outage in another BAA, the import schedule doesn't show up. Is there an automatic adjustment to the export schedule?
I think the way our tagging rules would work is that if they're unable to tag the import, they can't tag the export portion of it. They're coupled.
Okay. And then if there's, after the tagging occurs, if there's a disruption, is there an adjustment at some point?
Yeah, so to the extent that the market can resolve it, then like the next market run, we would try to address it if the half, we would try to address it in the next half run. These are all, hourly block schedules.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your Again, moving to the next caller. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Jim Bushnell from the Market Surveillance Committee. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, hi, Jim.
Okay, great. Yeah, I actually got in the queue during the Mark Holman's discussion, and now I have things to comment on for pretty much every caller here. So when Partha was asking about other ISOs, I've been doing my informal sort of just reaching out to contacts in these places because I was curious as well. And what I found striking was, yeah, it actually took a long time to even get them to understand the questions because the paradigm is just so different, partly because they interact a lot more with other ISOs. And I guess I was talking to Eastern ISOs, so maybe they had less of this kind of conflict of paradigms that the CAISO has to struggle with. And the other part was they just have a very different and in de facto much higher scarcity prices. And so the cost of forcing a wheel through during a period where you were actually curtailing load would be really, really expensive in a place like ISO New England. And so I think they just considered that unlikely as well. It certainly hasn't come up. So that's just an observation. Yeah, as far as what it means for the TLR equivalents, I think that's an interesting sort of direction to explore, and it just comes down to the fact that CAISO doesn't really have the equivalent of a long-term, at least physical transmission contract. And so, you know, the idea of how you prioritize a long-term wheel is, you know, is unanswered because there are no such things as long-term wheels really under the current paradigm. But just a second observation based on a couple of the conversations is that I do think that there was still maybe too much confusion over the mechanics of what the proposal would do, and that wasn't allowing discussion over the policy implications of them. But, you know, going back to Mark's questions or comments, I thought it was pretty clear in the appendix to the proposal, and Partha's comments sort of highlighted this too, that yes, indeed, an import that bids a negative price is going to have a priority over a self-scheduled wheel during a stressed condition when the penalties on the exports are binding. And that, you know, we can have a discussion about what the implications of that are, but I just think that is, in fact, true. And that means that RA imports that do self-schedule would have priority, which I think is a perfectly appropriate situation. Not all RA imports are going to have that priority unless they self-schedule, though. So that's kind of an issue of should that be left to a PUC regulation or should it be left to the LSEs to make sure that their imports are doing that? Do they have the right incentives to do that? Those sorts of questions. But also that, you know, other imported load that is maybe not, you know, what you might consider RA that bids a negative price could also have that priority. Now, would they want to do that? There would be a potentially, you know, there would be an implicitly very high price associated with that. But I just think the mechanics do allow for that possibility to arise. And similarly, the discussion about RUC, as I understand it, if load does not, if load bids a super high price in IFM and doesn't get awarded or just doesn't, you know, underbids their load altogether, then there is going to be a different treatment of that load going into RUC based on the ISO forecast than, say, an economically sold export. Again, what's the appropriate policy interpretation of that? When do you declare something firm is a discussion that, you know, that goes beyond that. But I think the mechanics of it are that load that doesn't buy out of the IFM but is in the ISO forecast is going to be treated differently in RUC than an economic export. So then my question that I had was about the attestation. So I think this is a question for Don, and you kind of answered it. I've been wondering what the definition of a forward contract is, and what, I don't know how the pros and cons of trying to really clarify this. but how forward is a forward contract? You said 15 minutes before the IFM is not what you intended. What about 2 days and so forth? And it sounds like the master file is sort of your time frame that you're thinking of as the definition of forward contract, which I believe yeah.
That's correct. And so basically you can make a change request, at any time, but they become effective in 5 days.
Okay. So effectively there's sort of a 5-day window for something becoming a forward contract.
Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful. All right. So that's the end of my comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. All right, Kira, do we have anybody else in the queue?
We have no further questions in the queue.
Okay. Anyone from ISO have anything to wrap up before we go to lunch?
Hey, Christina, this is Guillermo. I just want to make one clarification from our previous discussion earlier today about Oasis. I think we have another item to check related to the publication of Oasis. I know there is a topic for discussion later today. My only clarification is that we do have a Oasis display in which we can see the aggregated level of imports and exports. For IFM, is fully available. I think Dave's comment was more about the ROC, and I just check, and ROC seems to require some updates because it seems to be just showing incremental dispatches from IFM. And when we're talking about curtailments of exports, I think there will be no way to know that information. So as part of the Oasis display that we're going to be updating for the summer, I think we may just have to check to drop this other display. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Guillermo. So I just want to give one more opportunity to ask questions. I know it's a big topic before we go to lunch. So again, press pound 2 if you have questions or comments. No one in the queue, Kira?
Correct.
Okay. So we're going to go ahead and take a lunch break. We're going to start back up at 1 with the EIM coordination and the resource efficiency test review topic. So we'll meet back here at 1 o'clock. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. So the next topic is Danny Johnson with Policy is going to present the EIM coordination and the resource efficiency test proposal. So Danny, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Christina. Next slide, please. So we are proposing to enhance the resource efficiency evaluation. The first enhancement would be to ensure that BAAs are providing sufficient capacity to meet their uncertainty needs in addition to the forecasted load. This will be adding the uncertainty requirement to the bid range capacity test. So this uncertainty requirement is currently calculated in the flex RAM test. It will now just be added to the capacity that a balancing authority area has to show as part of the bid range capacity test. We do acknowledge that adding what is essentially the flexible ramping product demand curve to the capacity that must be showing may lead to BAAs failing more often and sooner. However, we think that this is appropriate as it will serve to ensure that BAAs are not able to lean on other BAAs within the EIM to meet their uncertainty requirements. In the comments we received and the previous discussion we had on the straw proposal and in the MSC, there was a number of concerns raised about where the RSE goes forward from here. We had a lot of commenters who acknowledged that this was a really complicated topic and that the ISO needs to really carefully think through any changes that we would be making to the RSE to either the test design or the potential consequences. We had other commenters who were more supportive of adding some consequences for failure of the RSE in time for summer 2021. We do not plan on making any additional changes outside what's identified in the draft final proposal in time for the start of summer 2021. However, we do plan to continue a stakeholder discussion on what the consequences for RSC failure would be. I saw a copy of our revised roadmap. I would expect this to probably start early in Q2 of 2021. Should we be able to work through that stakeholder process in the early part of the summer, we would look to add whatever the resolution of that process is as soon as possible, potentially even for the latter parts of summer 2021. Again, that's an open stakeholder process. That's our goal with that process. Next slide. We also are making a couple additional changes to ensure that there's better coordination between the BAAs that operate in the EAM. In our draft final proposal, we detailed this as preserving the last RTD solution, which should ensure that if a BAA is in contingency operations for a prolonged period of time, there are not adverse impacts. We would move to update and enable auto mirroring where existing mirrors are defined. And we would also move to better coordinate the penalty price parameters to ensure that intertie transactions between BAAs aren't inadvertently cut to satisfy constraints within a different BAA. In addition to those changes, we are also proposing to resolve 2 defects that were identified in the review of the August 2020 events. The first is accounting for resource derates and re-rates. The partial derates and re-rates were not accounted for in August. And the second is to resolve double counting of mirror resources. So that is a summary of our changes. I'd like to pause and open it up and see if we have any questions.
Great, thank you. So if you do have a question, press pound 2 to raise your hand.
We have a question in the queue. Let's go to the first caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Danny. This is Laura Trelease from the Bonneville Power Administration. And first of all, thanks for the proposed improvements to the RS test and the commitment to a subsequent stakeholder process to discuss failure consequences. And, you know, we also acknowledge and respect the time constraints that CAISO is under for this summer. One of the things we continue to struggle with is how these improvements fully close the gap to get to an accurate and effective RS test that's equitably applied to all EI amenities in the CAISO BA. And so I have a question about the scope of the subsequent stakeholder process. But before that, the graphic that continues to be puzzling to us is one that CAISO showed in the January 13th resource efficiency workshop, where CAISO had, for hour ending 18 of August 14, showed the RS requirement and then the RS capacity values that were being shown for the CAISO BA. And during this interval, CAISO was declaring an EEA2, I think EEA3 by the end of the hour. And CAISO was showing 2,500 to 3,500 megawatts of available bid range capacity. I think given these emergency conditions, it seems like, you know, based on the NERC definitions, all available generation would be in use. So our expectation would be that the RS test results would have showed 0 available bid range capacity or even negative. And so I think we're struggling to see how these changes would result in that type of a test result, given the magnitude of how much is being shown as available for the CAISO. And so I just, if you have some comments on that, is our understanding of what the test results should show match what the CAISO's expectation would be?
So Laura, I think that the changes we are proposing to make get us part of the way there. I think what you're really getting at is how does a BAA, if you're in an energy emergency, potentially pass the RSC? And the answer is that we are currently we're not considering intertemporal constraints within this test right now, just as part of the test design. There's a number of reasons which we kind of talked about in our paper about why we don't do that. But short of doing that, I think it would be really hard to make a test that accurately captured the capacity that a BAA had available that hour going into the EIM.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's the magnitude of capacity that's being shown for the CAISO BA that's most striking, and so I understand that 100% accuracy might not be feasible, but I think something to get closer to closing the gap would be helpful to see. So I guess a request would be if CAISO could provide a recalculation of the bid range capacity test requirement and the capacity values for all the intervals it was in any EA 2 and 3 and be able to show what gap remains. That would be really helpful information, I think, to be able to do that crosswalk. And my follow-up question is addressing the additional shortcomings, will that be part of the stakeholder process, or is the stakeholder process only focused on failure consequence?
I think that's a little bit TBD. I know that the stakeholder process will be focused on failure consequences, trying to get something in place for later this summer. I don't know if that's a phase 2 of that initiative. It would be a broader RSC conversation, or if that may be better discussed in the context of EDAM. I think that's still something we're trying to work through.
Okay, that's helpful. I think just given the importance of the RS test to the EIM entities and it being foundational to the decision to join the EIM, making sure that it's accurate and effective, as I mentioned, and equitably applied, I think is a big priority. So I think there would be concerns about waiting for EDAM to be the venue to have a comprehensive discussion on it. So again, understand that time constraints for this summer, but just want to make sure that CAISO understands that it's a high priority to us.
This is Anna. I just wanted to clarify, if I may. Hi, guys. Can you all hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Anna.
I just want to make sure it's clear that we are looking to, deal with some of these issues in the EDAM process, but I think, it's also the case that the ISO will be looking at the RST in the context of the EIM later this year. So I think some of the issues that you all have raised are, things we're going to look into, but what we tried to make clear in the DSP was that for the purposes of this round with the summer initiative and the March board meeting, we're going to have to put some pencils down so we can move forward. So we will be looking to, if there's any additional changes we can make to the tests and the consequences of the tests, later this year as well. So in the context of EIM, I'm sorry, I hope that wasn't missed as a message. I wanted to reinforce that.
I appreciate that. That's helpful. Thanks, Hannah.
Okay, do we have any other questions, Kiara?
At this time, there are no more questions in the queue.
All right. Thank you, Danny. So, Danielle, are you on?
Yep.
I am.
All right. Take it away.
All right. Thanks, Christina. So good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing our draft final proposal for import market incentives during tight system conditions. I've got 4 slides I want to get through today, and then I'll pause for questions and or comments. So again, this might seem like a rehash or a repeat from what we heard at the last MSC meeting, but this proposal is really targeted at improving the incentives for imports during tight system conditions when supply is needed the most. And this slide reviews some background and a bit of our reasoning behind the current proposal. So currently, hourly block imports are scheduled in the hour-ahead scheduling process, or HASC, but then are settled based on the 15-minute market, or FMM prices. The FMM price can sometimes clear below the supplier's offer price, which has been highlighted as a concern by market participants, particularly because the CAISO market does not provide any sort of make-whole payment mechanism to hourly block economic imports. So suppliers can end up being at risk of being paid less than their bid price. And this risk of being paid less than the bid price can be of especially concern during the tight system conditions. And the final root cause analysis pointed that out. During the summer events, the CAISO needed energy in excess of its resource adequacy capacity. And during these tight system conditions, the CAISO system operators took out-of-market measures to ensure reliability. And these measures included upward adjustments to the load forecast in half and making out-of-market import purchases. And what happened as a result of that is that those measures tended to suppress or lower the FMM prices relative to HASP prices. So this initiative is really targeting those instances and making sure that we're incentivizing the import offers when we need them the most. And then a final note on this slide, as James mentioned in the beginning of this call in his review of the stakeholder comments, we've ruled out any previously proposed option that included settling based on HASP prices, because incorporating HASP prices would require extensive system and process changes that are not feasible to implement by this coming summer. That being said, we will consider settling at HASP prices during tight system conditions in the Scarcity Pricing Initiative we have planned to start later this year. If we move on to the next slide, we'll discuss more details related to the proposal outlined in the draft final proposal. So as I mentioned previously, we're focusing only on providing a make-whole payment to the bid price for real-time market hourly block economic imports during the identified tight system condition intervals. And those tight system conditions, are based on pre-established public operator alerts or warnings. So if the CAISO issues an alert notice by 3 p.m. the day before anticipated operating reserve deficiencies, or if a warning notice that indicates we're anticipating using electricity reserves has been issued, or if emergency stages 1, 2, or 3 are issued, then we would apply the make-whole payment settlement rule to the hours defined by these alerts and or warnings. And our intent with this proposal is really focused on applying the make-whole payment settlement rule in only the tight system condition intervals, which focuses on the times when the amount of contracted supply may not be adequate to meet load and reserve requirements. And I think it's also important to note that this make-whole payment settlement rule would be provided on an hour-by-hour basis as opposed to, say, netting over the course of the day in which these tight system conditions had occurred. Further, this proposal would apply to real-time market import amounts that are incremental to any import amount scheduled in the day-ahead market, as well as day-ahead scheduled exports that the real-time market reduces. So these day-ahead scheduled exports that are rebid in the real-time market and reduced are consequently considered real-time market imports. And I want to make that clear. It also applies to those reduced day-ahead scheduled exports. Finally, we're proposing to allocate the uplift costs from the make-whole payments to load, exports, and EIM transfers out. The cost allocation methodology we've developed for this is consistent and similar to how the real-time market bid cost recovery uplift payments are allocated between balancing authority areas. So if we move to the next slide, we get into a couple of high-level examples outlining how these make-whole payments will be calculated. So our first high-level example is for a multi-segment hourly block incremental import bid. let's assume that the tight system conditions have been identified for 1 hour based on the criteria we've discussed on the previous slide, and then the following conditions exist. So we have a supplier that submitted an import bid at $100 per megawatt hour for 0 to 50 megawatts, and also for 50 to 100 megawatts at $150 per megawatt hour. The HASP prices are greater than the import bid price, and HASP ends up scheduling a 100 megawatt import based on the import bid. The FMM prices decrease compared to the HASP price and end up averaging to be $90 per megawatt hour for the 4 FMM intervals in the tight system condition hour. So based on the proposal to calculate the hourly make-whole payment amount as the positive difference between the bid price and the hourly average FMM price, the make-whole payment for this import bid will be $35 per megawatt hour. And we get that by taking the $10 difference between the first bid segment price and the FMM price multiplied by the number of megawatts scheduled from the first bid segment of 50, plus the $60 difference between the second bid segment price and the FMM price multiplied by the number of megawatts scheduled from the second bid segment. And that gives us the $35 per megawatt hour make-whole payment. And on the next slide, this is our last slide of this topic, this is an example for an export that's been scheduled in the day-ahead market but has been rebid in the real-time market. So the supplier submitted an export bid in the day-ahead market for 100 megawatts. They've rebid that export in the real-time market at $100 per megawatt hour. The HASP prices are greater than the export bid, and HASP ends up reducing the export schedule to 0 megawatts, which effectively turns this bid into a 100 megawatt real-time market import bid. And once again, here we see that the FMM prices decrease to an average of $90 per megawatt hour for that hour. And based on the proposal, the make-whole payment for this bid would be $10 per megawatt hour. And that calculation is laid out on the slide in bold. So I know that was quite a bit of information, and I want to pause here and see if there's any questions or comments from stakeholders.
Again, press #2 to raise your hand. And Kira, let me know if anybody's in the queue.
We do have one caller in the queue. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. It's Mark Holman at PowerX. I had a question just on your point on the cost allocation there. First, I think this is an important improvement during those critical hours that the CAISO is seeking additional imports, and I think it's a very narrow bid cost recovery, which makes sense to us to support you in those circumstances. But can you just go to the slide with the cost allocation? I'm just wondering, can you explain EIM transfers? I understand why load and why intertie exports would be allocated the cost as a proxy for load. I'm just struggling a little bit with the EIM transfers out if this is a mechanism to acquire supply ahead of the FMM through the intertie bidding framework to ensure reliability. Why would that be? Why would EIM transfers out be part of that allocation?
Yeah, Danielle, this is Brad. I can take this one. Yeah, Mark. I know this looks odd, so to speak, for lack of a better word. But what we're trying to do is this is just the same methodology that is going in place this spring also that we changed in the real-time settlement review to allocate BCR, real-time market BCR costs between EIM balancing authority areas. And So in reality, that EIM transfers out if we're really short and in system emergencies, in reality, that wouldn't come into play, it seems. But to the extent, for some reason, EIM transfers out were part of the overall Cal ISO BAA demand, then they're included in there similar to exports.
That's helpful, Brad. I just ask you to maybe, and it may not be a lot of dollars, but and it might be simplicity to apply this same formula, but I think it might be helpful to think about this one a little bit more and it's a little bit different. And the reason I say that is the CAISO might often be an importer during these intervals, so it might not be a lot and it should be pretty narrow. But if you think about it from our perspective, other BAs purchase hour-ahead supply in the bilateral markets, and that is typically at a price, if you look back at the data, that's higher than the FMM, and they don't pass those costs through to other EIM entities, including the CAISO. And so there's a little bit of an asymmetry here. If this was being done across all hours, it would make sense to me, kind of like a bid cost recovery, such as starting up thermal units that support others. But given that this is really being done for the reliability and to acquire supply for the CAISO BAA, and that others have alternative mechanisms and they don't pass those costs through, they incur the cost of buying bilateral energy in that hour-ahead time frame, and then the FMM may be lower and they take a loss on that and they don't pass that loss through. And I'm not suggesting they should. It just seems like this one might be a little bit different, and I don't want to make it complex, but it seems appropriate for exports, but I'm struggling a little bit with the EIM transfers out. It's small. It may be de minimis if you're not exporting. CAISO BA is not exporting during those conditions and it's a limited number of hours. Just to think through the rationale on that a little bit.
Yeah, help me understand why you're saying it would make sense for exports and not transfers out.
I think because when you look at, someone could be, for lack of a better description, leaning on the CAISO through day-ahead exports or through HASP exports to serve their load. But once you get into the FMM and you get into the EIM operation, now everyone should be resource sufficient, and what you procured ahead of the EIM is your cost to get there. And so if you think of, pick any BA outside, you can use us for example. If we're procuring HASP supply, or so let's say we're buying bilateral energy hour ahead, and doing that so that we can get into the EIM resource sufficient, and we end up buying that, let's say on a tight day at $500 and the FMM ends up being at $50, we bear all of that. We don't pass any of that cost through to other EIM entities. And so I kind of see this as symmetric to that if the CAISO is buying supply ahead of EIM operations to get to being resource sufficient, and that supply is being bought for its load and its forward day ahead or hour ahead exports, then should it be passing those costs when it takes a loss that it's having to buy hour ahead energy, firm energy in the bilateral markets at a premium to the FMM price? Should the CAISO measured demand not eat that cost as their cost of getting supply to be resource sufficient? And so it just seems more analogous to that, Brad, that we're all buying supply outside the CAISO in the hour-ahead time frame, and we may take a loss relative to the FMM, and we don't pass that through. Should the CAISO be passing that through in this particular circumstance?
Okay. Yeah, we'll think about it.
Thanks, I appreciate it. And if you give some estimate of the dollars, it might be so small that it doesn't, if it causes a settlement complexity, we'd understand that, but just, it's a different way of looking at it.
And that's a big portion of our motivation too, is just to allocate it the same way as the real-time bid cost recovery.
Thanks, Brad. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Do you have any other questions, Pierre?
We have 2 more questions in the queue. Let's go to the next caller. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, it's Mary Lynch with Constellation. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Mary. Go ahead.
Hi. And I'm sorry, I missed a little bit of this section, and so my question is just really quick. Is this, the way this is set up in this presentation, have there been any changes since the last discussion of this, or is it still the same?
By last discussion, if you mean the Market Surveillance Committee meeting back on February 11th, then no.
Yep.
But this proposal has changed since the straw proposal.
Yeah. No, I meant from the MSC. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to the next caller. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Christina. It's Mark Smith with Calpine. You know, I think we'll probably support this proposal. It's something that we've supported in the past. It makes sense to give imports at least some assurance that their accepted bids will be what they are paid. But to my knowledge, it doesn't do anything to address sort of this fundamental or systemic difference between HASP and FMM prices. And again, of course, internal generation, which I represent for the most part, is not availed of that HASP price. Is there anything in this proposal, from your view, that will reduce the incentives for operators to load bias in the HASP and therefore disadvantage the FMM or lower the FMM prices?
Thanks, Mark, for your question. This is Danielle. You know what? That really wasn't within the scope of this topic of the initiative. We were really targeting just providing the incentives for imports to provide the needed supply. So that was really the scope of this topic.
All right, Danielle, thanks. You know, I'll drop some comments along these lines.
Yeah, Mark,
Go ahead, Brad.
Hey, Mark. You know, other changes were, though they won't be in place for this summer, but, you know, other changes, or notably the ensuring the flexible ramping product is deliverable, would be something more to reduce the operator's incentive to load bias. You know, this change is really in recognition that they may have to do that to preserve reliability, which then can upset the price signals for imports, or at least upset the payment for them.
Well, okay, so maybe in my comments I'll just ask for some kind of transparency to the extent that HASP load biasing occurs. I know that DMM reports it. I don't know if it's quarterly or occasionally, but that's something that we will probably put in comments. Thanks, folks.
Okay.
We do have one more question in the queue. Your line's been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Good afternoon, Josh Arnold, PG&E. I had just a quick sort of tangential question on this. I think this is a pretty acceptable proposal for the summer, but my question is, do we know why market participants, the importers, are not making use of the 15-minute economic dispatch blocks or the hourly block with single curtailment? If the worry is about pricing and compensation for their imports, do we know why they're not making use of the more price-sensitive bidding mechanisms?
Thanks for your comment, Josh. To my knowledge, no, we don't know that for sure, but I'll refer to my colleague.
Yes, this is Don. So, Josh, some of the things I've heard is, you know, you have to procure transmission on an hourly basis beforehand, and so are you really going to want to incur that expense, not knowing that you're going to be dispatched and use that transmission at every 15-minute interval? But I would point out that in these very tight system conditions, I think the risk of, you know, buying transmission and basically losing money because you bought that transmission is pretty low, even if you don't get scheduled at your max output for every single 15-minute interval.
Thanks, Don. That was kind of where my thought process was going, thinking through the logic of it, especially given the DMM's Q3 report that came out earlier this month, where they highlighted that the FMM prices are typically higher than the HASP. And this is me just being, on a personal basis. I'm not representing PG&E on this statement, but it just seems like somebody got caught making a bad gamble here. And I recognize that we needed the power, or we thought we needed the power more accurately from a systems perspective. But it sort of feels like we're trying to undermine, in some ways, the steps we were taking under FERC 764 to bring the interties in a more reliable fashion to meet the changing forecasts. And in the draft final proposal, you guys commented specifically about August, I think it was 16th, which was not one of the days we had the load curtailments. But one of the things the DMM pointed out on that day is that the load forecasts were, actual load was much lower than the forecasts because of voluntary curtailments that were done due to the flex alert that the CAISO called within California. So it sort of feels like, yeah, we thought we needed the imports. We didn't really need the imports. And when the load comes in so much lower than the past forecast, these imports actually are helping to cause the drive down in prices in the FMM because there is no ability to then curtail them when the forecast comes in high. And we need to start shedding generation. We need to stop. We need to cut back on supply. And let's be honest, there's always going to be problems with lumpy power, with block energy power that way. It seems like we're taking a bit of a step back from the principles that we were trying to get to under FERC 764. That's me personally, not PG&E at this point. I think from a PG&E perspective, just like the Calpine, we can accept this, especially for the summer. And I do also want to really thank whoever wrote the tariff language for this section. That was very well written, and I really appreciate the clarity that they put into that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is Brad. I just add, we don't disagree with you, Josh, that we don't want to undermine our 15-minute market, and that's why we're proposing this under very specific conditions where, we're anticipating reserve deficiencies. So, we shouldn't have the issues with oversupply. And there's incentives offered into the market, into the ISO market, and then there's disincentives. One potential fair disincentive is that to get the price guaranteed, you have to bid on a 15-minute basis where you may end up not being dispatched all the time. And so when suppliers are making their evaluation whether they want to offer to the ISO or somewhere else, that could be a disincentive to offer to the ISO. So that's why we're proposing this, but just targeted under real tight conditions, because we don't agree with you that we don't disagree with you. Let's say that we don't want to undermine the 15-minute market under most conditions.
Oh no, I understand that. I agree with you entirely. That's why I think PG&E can support this. We've been drafting some comments already, but I think this is a good step. I think for this summer, I'm just not sure how viable it is from a longer term perspective. But I definitely do appreciate what you're saying. I support that. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh.
Anyone else in the queue, Kira?
There are no further questions in the queue.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to the next topic. We have scarcity price enhancements. So, Perry, you on the phone?
Thanks, Christina. Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, sure. Okay, thanks. So we have I believe one slide on this, and it's here. Yeah, so I'm here to describe what ended up in the draft final proposal. where we're proposing to move forward with the scarcity pricing enhancement to release reserves at bid cap price when we arm load to meet our contingency reserve requirements. Recall, we were concerned that our current practices may actually reduce market prices at a time when the system's very stressed. And this happens currently when supply conditions are very tight, we arm load to meet our contingency reserve requirements. And when we do this, we then release the generation that was previously meeting those reserve requirements for use as energy. And this energy is currently used by the market at bid cost, which may actually reduce market clearing prices. The proposal here is to release those reserves at bid cap price. This makes sense because it ensures that the real-time price reflects the fact that when the CAISO is arming load to meet its reserve requirements, the system is short of energy, and the price will reflect this shortage. We had a couple of questions from stakeholders on how this interplays with our 831 bid cap proposals, and we added another paragraph, I think, to the draft final proposal. And it just, in short, it just means these reserves will go into the energy bid stack at either a $1,000 cap or under the certain circumstances, the $2,000 bid cap price. Regarding the previous penalty price scaling proposal, that's the last bullet on this slide, in order to prioritize ours and stakeholders' efforts in this initiative, we're no longer proposing to scale the real-time market penalty prices relative to the $2,000 per megawatt hour power balance penalty price during tight system conditions. So I believe that's the only slide. If you want to just click forward one and back, I have a different slide deck in front of me, but yeah, okay, cool. You can come back and we can take some questions.
Sure. Do we have anybody in the queue, Kira? Again, press pound 2 to raise your hand.
We do have a couple questions in the queue. Let's go to the first caller. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Perry. It's Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I wanted to drill down into the specific timing of what you mean by arming load. So the easiest way for me to think about it is what happened last summer. So when you're looking at the different timeframes described in the root cause analysis, it said the CAISO was arming load at about 3:20 through midnight. But if you look at EEA3 and when that firm load shed was actually deployed, that would have been more like 6:30 to 7:40 or maybe 8:30, because that's when it actually ended. So can you drill down more specifically when the prices would exactly go to the cap?
Right. So I don't have the timing from the report, and I'm not sure when the report was referring to arming load, if it meant arming load for the purpose of meeting a contingency reserve requirement or starting to make preparations for some kind of controlled load shed later in the day. To us, there's a difference between those two things. This proposal focused on specifically when we're arming load for the purpose of meeting our contingency reserve requirements. I don't have the log in front of me. I believe it was if the load shedding. Oh geez, I'm going to get it wrong if I try to remember.
It's okay.
But I think there's a good question there about duration, perhaps, and that we intend to have this be these bids will remain in the stack at bid cap price from the time that operators begin arming load to meet contingency reserve requirements until they can meet their contingency reserve requirements without arming load. So it'll truly be, it truly is, at the time that the operators are making the calls to arm the load. And then what they do is they try to scale back from that. After the load's been armed, for contingency reserves, supplies become less and less scarce. They can now meet their contingency reserve requirements with real generation, and then they start to, I think the words they use, they start to flag out the contingency reserves instead of having the armed load. So it would just be for the way I understand it is it'll be for the duration that the load is armed for the purpose of meeting contingency reserve requirements.
Okay, I guess it's not entirely clear, and I think it's pretty important because I'm not sure if you're saying the price would have been $2,000 for 7 hours or whether it had the potential to be $2,000 for 2 hours. That's a pretty big pricing difference. Maybe I'll try and ask the question again. So when you're saying the operators are arming load for contingency response, so the root cause analysis time period that I referenced, so that was for arming firm load for contingency response specifically. And that was a really long time period. But the reserves, or, quote unquote, the load as reserves was only deployed for a much shorter period. So when I read this bullet, release reserves at bid cap, when short on contingency reserves and resorting to arming load, I read that as saying, okay, during that longer period, during that 7-hour period where you're arming load, when they deploy the load shed, basically, as reserves, that's when the prices will be $2,000?
No. It's not the shedding of the load. So think about it this way. My first point is the prices will not be it's a much shorter time period than the 7 hours that they've actually released these reserves to be used as energy. It's not 7 hours. So I'll start there. I can't tell you the exact time frame it was right now, but it was not for the full 7 hours. So what's going on here is they're arming load to meet contingency reserves, and whenever they begin to then release those reserves for use as energy, that's whenever those bids will be seen by the market as $2,000 energy bids.
I see. So when you're converting energy, that's the $2,000.
Yeah. Whenever the market needs to convert and whenever the market needs that energy, that's when the price would drive up to the bid cap.
Gotcha. Do you have any, I don't think it talked about when you guys converted the reserves to energy in the report. Do you have any data on when that was or how long that would be? And is it only in the 15-minute market then and not in the 5-minute market? Because you can't release reserves.
It would be in. So those reserves, the energy bids corresponding to those reserves go into the market. So it could be in the 15-minute or the 5-minute market.
Oh, I see. Okay. Reserves. Okay, so you're gonna, when you release the reserves, quote unquote, you're gonna insert them in at a $2,000 price into the. So reserves are going to look like they have an hourly bid of $2,000.
Yeah. So that's what we've been meaning when we say release reserves. You no longer are saving reserves on generating units as contingency reserves. You're instead saying, market, you can use these as energy, and all that means is they go into the energy bid stack at the bid cap price.
Gotcha.
So when the market needs to use them, then you'll see that pricing in the market.
Okay, very helpful. I understand now. Thank you.
Any other questions, Kira?
We're in the queue.
Did you say there were no further questions? I'm sorry.
Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with CLECA. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, Paul, I hear you.
Okay, so thanks for the clarification. So this is when you just said when contingency reserves are released to utilize load to serve energy because you've armed load. Did this happen during the stage 3 on August 14th?
we were arming load to meet contingency reserve requirements, and we were releasing then the reserves for use as energy. I think on both the 14th and 15th.
So does the impact of this mean if you had had this rule in place on August 14th, if you would have had a price at the bid cap until you ended the stage 3, or no longer did this? Because
no,
would have been the impact?
I understand the question. Let me take a stab. So so we would release the reserves at some time prior to whenever we were actually shedding load. So you may have seen the price be at the bid cap prior to when we started shedding load. Now, what drives what that price is and how long you see that price is if the market actually needs to clear those bids as energy, then the market will say, oh, here's a bid at 2,000. It's the only bid left, or under August 14th to 15th conditions, here's a bid at 1,000, and it's the only energy left, so it clears it, and then that sets the market clearing price.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, coming back out of load shed, if the market no longer needs those reserve bids that have been inserted in as energy and there's a cheaper option, the market will begin using the cheaper option, and you start seeing the prices come back down.
Okay. So you can still see prices come down while you're still arming load to meet the contingency reserve requirements. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll add that we're only ever really taking this action. This is one of the steps leading into make sure you do this prior to going into load shedding. So, it is part of the EEA3 steps that we have once we're in EEA3 to do this. But yeah, you're right that to point out that the duration of the pricing outcome will be driven on the actual supply and demand at that time. And I'll just say, practically speaking, we're right at the brink. Operators have determined we need these reserves as energy. More than likely, the market's going to be picking these reserves up as energy at the bid cap price.
Well, there's a philosophical question. I mean, if you're at a stage 3 and you've got rotating outages, what should the price be, regardless of what your market model says? If customers, certain customers can't get their loads satisfied, what should the price be?
Yeah, you're right. There is a philosophical question there that we didn't take up in this.
And if there's prices at $100 per megawatt hour coming out of your 15 or your 5-minute market, when customers on rotating outages, there's something. What's right and which is correct? The need for rotating outages, or the $100 price that says you could add additional load at 150 or 100 or whatever it is. But you've said, no, we need load curtailment. So is that being addressed at all?
No, that's not being addressed here.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you for your question. Let's go to the next caller. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead. Caller, your device may be on mute. Moving to the next call in the queue. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Partha Malbadkar with PG&E. Yeah, thanks, Kerry, for the explanation. I had a couple of questions. This is on slide 32, and maybe this would be good with some examples on And this is sort of maybe similar to the conversation we had at the MSC meeting in terms of how would this bid cap price be determined based on the 831 policy. And I'm still not sure I fully understand sort of under different circumstances, like for example, if an import bid is being allowed to set the price above the current $1,000 constraint, but has to cost justify. So let's just say that there's an index you're using for a certain hour. How would that bid price cap interact with this? Would it automatically jump to $2,000, or would it be set at $1,000? And I just think that some examples of that would be helpful.
Sure. So just on the phone right now, to try to answer the question without a complex example, is and we try to lay this out in the paper, is that if we get a submitted and cost verified energy bid from a resource specific resource greater than 1,000, for purposes of this enhancement here, we would consider the bid cap price to be $2,000 a megawatt hour. Also, if we have a CAISO calculated maximum import bid price, and we use, I think, Danielle can correct me if I'm wrong, we use those to screen the costs of the import bids. If we have one of those that are greater than 1,000, then the bid cap price we're talking about here for purposes of this initiative is $2,000 per megawatt hour. So it's either like it is today, where these reserves will go in at $1,000 at today's $1,000 bid cap price, or they would go in at $2,000 if the conditions for the higher than 1,000 cap is met.
That's really helpful. Maybe I can follow up with you offline to try to understand more. Maybe I'll get to my next question of your next bullet says we'll send stronger price signal for the need for supply. And maybe I sort of highlight first on the interties, obviously you're changing your policy, particularly for block hourly bids, to allow for greater cost certainty. So to some degree, in my mind, you've addressed the issue of imports through that mechanism into trying to get, the combination of 831 and that price guarantee mechanism is really providing a much stronger incentive. Is there any other information sort of just based on sort of the August events that indicated that that the price signals were not sufficient to get supply? Was there stuff not running during these emergency situations because of this? Because of the way the market was functioning?
Yeah, I don't have any, in front of me right now, any of that type of information. I think that, theoretically speaking here, the idea is that we are at a point in which we can no longer meet our energy requirements and our reserve requirements without basically taking load to the brink and saying we're going to drop you if any contingency happens. So just logically, it makes sense that whenever the system is that tight, that we should be sending a stronger price signal, regardless of what's going on with, I think your example was potentially an import with a cost verified price of say $1,200 or something. And the idea that we're trying to get at on the slide, just to kind of follow that up, is there's two aspects of this. First is that if we're at the brink and we're doing this type of action, we want to be sending the strong price signal now. You could argue, I think this is what you were getting at, that in that time period, what's that going to do? You already have all of the bids. How are you attracting more supply or whatever? But what we're after here is the policy of pricing it this way, in and of itself, is what we're saying would attract more supply to the market. They know they're going to be compensated at this scarcity rate by by offering into CAISO's markets, and if things get this bad.
No, I can appreciate that, Perry. At least it'd be nice to sort of understand, like based on any of the past events, was this actually, for lack of a better term, the ISOs earlier indicated a number of items weren't feasible in terms of implementing by this summer, and that to some degree that there certainly have been risks raised in terms of enhancing, there's risk raised and there's obviously implementation concerns associated with getting this done right and quickly. And so my own question is just basically like, if the CAISO really had a strong showing that said, yeah, this is really causing, for lack of a better term, these certain resources not to show up during our emergency situations, I could certainly understand the need to address this issue. But given sort of the other priorities that the CAISO is not able to do and sort of the implementation concerns, I think the ISO, it'd be nice to sort of see a stronger case in terms of what this is doing for the market for this summer in terms of maintaining reliability. But it's probably a much broader discussion on sort of what's the long-term effects of these policies or not. But at least I would think that the CAISO would really be wanting to prioritize those discrete elements that will be able to move the needle on summer reliability. And so, yeah, just my thoughts. But yeah, thank you, Perry. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael.
Moving to the next caller in the queue. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Perry. It's Carrie Bentley again from WPTF. Two quick follow-up questions. So when you say you're going to insert the offers at $2,000, and that is an hourly, Brad said that was an hourly offer. So scheduling coordinators aren't allowed to change their offers intra-hour, but will the CAISO have that functionality so you won't have to wait till the next hourly offer to update the prices?
Yep, we'll have that functionality. It's at the time they're released. There's a price that I don't know how to describe it without getting into the weeds on the implementation. But yeah, I think the short answer is yes. When the operators choose to release the reserves for use as energy, the market has the capability to release them at some defined price. And here, what we're doing is defining that as the bid cap price.
Okay, thanks. And then,
even if it's mid-hour, I think.
Even if it's mid-hour, thanks.
Yes.
I think that help answer Paul's duration question too when we go and look back. And then the second question is, am I wrong in thinking this is essentially overriding a scheduling coordinator's offer? Because when you offer and spin a non-spin, you have to have an underlying energy offer. So you're essentially telling them, no, you can't put in your own offer price, and we're going to replace it with a different offer price.
Yeah. This is overriding it to get the pricing effect here, to show that the scarce condition, that we're on the brink, that we have armed the load to meet our contingency reserve requirements. We can no longer meet contingency reserves and energy requirements. So these resources can go into the bid stack at $2,000 or $1,000, depending on what the cap is at the time.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you see any potential issues with that? Because, I mean, I don't want to argue against this, obviously, because I think it does lead to better price formation, but you're basically not upholding a resource's willingness to provide energy at a certain level.
No, we hadn't really thought there was a big problem with this. We kind of modeled this after what we already do today with the contingent-only reserves, is that it forces them into the market. If we would release them, it would force them into the market at whatever the bid cap price is today. I think it's just hardwired at $1,000. So we thought it just kind of extending what we would, some treatment that we already use.
Okay, I'll think about it some more.
Brad, I don't see that as anything unfair. I mean, these are going to be the ground rules going into the market, so it's, people would know under these limited conditions that, yes, then we would revise their bid upwards to $1,000.
Or 2,000, right? Or
to 2,000, right? Yeah.
Yeah, should be. I think 831 is going to go into effect in March now. So I think it's 2,000. Okay. All right, makes sense. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for your question. Let's move to the last caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, you guys, this is Michelle Keto from the CPUC. I just had a couple of questions and some comments. So my first question is, I'm going to go back to Partha's example, and let's say that you have a internal resource-specific resource, and they cost justify a bid at $1,010, and let's say that they're the clearing price. Are you saying under this circumstance, the scarcity pricing for the unarmed, the load that's released goes up to 2,000, not the 1,010 that cleared the market?
No, the market would have to actually clear these reserves that are released as energy. So if the marginal resource is just Brad, am I getting this?
Oh, you're saying the marginal resource. Yeah, but yes,
if the
bids would go in at 2,000, but yeah, Perry's right. That's the
okay. So you're saying that
resource is the 1,200.
So just because we crossed over the threshold.
I'm sorry.
So if we cross over the threshold by a $10 mark, you're going to put these in at 2,000, and you expect them to be needed, and so you expect the price to go up to 2,000. Is that right?
Yeah, if the market needs them. And like I said, I think practically at this point, the market is going to need all of the supply it can get. So that then I guess the price could go to 2,000.
So what if the reason that we're in a really short position is because we have, a number of forced outages? So sort of getting, at the Texas example of 30% of the gas plants were offline. So let's assume that we're scarce because the resources aren't performing. Do you guys think that maybe it makes sense, if you're going to be doing scarcity pricing, to also think about penalty prices for generators that are underperforming during these circumstances? And why was that not a focus of your efforts as well? I mean, to sort of have both sides of the equation.
Yeah, I think this actually would penalize them because they'd have to buy back at $2,000.
Well, only if they're.
They got to buy back.
No, that's not true. No. Let's say that they're on a forced outage, a day before and a day after. All those penalties.
Yeah, I did. But a second ago when Partha was asking about additional supply, it's not just import supply. Just like Perry says, this does incent generators that have day-ahead schedules. If they don't have day-ahead schedules, yes, I guess. And I was about to say that, and I take that back. I think even that. I think knowing the potential that you're going to get higher prices in real time minimizes your incentive to have forced outages before the day-ahead market, or before the real-time market at least, to the extent you can avoid them, and it certainly incents generation that has day-ahead schedules to be running because it's higher prices that they're exposed to.
But why do we always talk about incentives? Why don't we talk about penalties? I mean, if you have penalties, then you also get the resources, if you have issues about DR resources that aren't showing up or any other RA resources, sort of like what they do back east. It seems odd to me that we only talk about scarcity pricing and we don't talk about penalties for resources that should be performing under these system conditions. I think it was in DMM's comments, and I'd also note that I think the Market Surveillance Committee has brought this up, and so I would encourage you to include this idea of penalties in with scarcity pricing and system market power. I think it goes hand in hand, and I think it's really critical from load's perspective, especially if they're going to have to pay prices like $2,000 for potentially underperformance on resources.
I mean, I think a resource with a day-ahead schedule that all of a sudden has to pay $2,000 to buy back that schedule. I mean, you call it what you want. It sounds like you want to call that a penalty. Okay. We're saying it's an incentive to perform.
So, Perry?
Very expensive.
Yeah, Perry, I absolutely.
Proposition.
So I agree with you, but what about the resource that's on forced outage for a week before and a week after, and it's 1,000 megawatts? They have a rain penalty, which, you know, is half of the CPM. It does not provide the incentive to be there. So how about just a penalty mechanism for, you know, the inability to produce for any reason under scarce conditions? It seems symmetric to me, and it seems only fair.
Well, those are enhancements they're pursuing in the RA Enhancements Initiative. You know, the forced out. No. I'm blanking on what they're calling it. You know, the force that you know the adjustment to how much you can provide RA is being explored as a replacement for penalties, but that is an effective penalty.
But that's lagged for a year, and it doesn't provide direct incentives. And I'm talking about, you know, economists are all about incentives, right? And incentives can be sort of positive incentives, and they can be equally well. I mean, that's demonstrated in economics that the negative incentives are just as effective. So I feel like we have to, if we're going to go to scarcity pricing, we also have to think of, you know, symmetric incentives for performance. And I'm not understanding. DMM has suggested this. I believe MSC has raised this, and I think it's really critical, and I'm asking you guys to consider it as part of your scarcity initiative, and I hope you do so. Thank you.
Sure. But like Perry said, this. Go ahead, Anna.
Hang on. I just wanted to ask.
I think your point is well taken. That for the longer term initiatives, we definitely want to look at those in a more holistic way. So, I mean, I think, you know, you're referring to. I just want to ask a clarifying question. Are you thinking of rain penalties, or are you thinking of like UGP type of penalties?
Absolutely not. I'm not thinking of rain penalties. I don't think rain penalties do this at all. I'm thinking of something more like what the eastern markets have. So you have a penalty for not performing if load hits 44,000 or 45,000. So literally, if you don't show up in the market for whatever reason, that be it imports, be it DR, be it resources, you get a penalty. And, you know, why not $1,000? Why not $2,000? We think load can, you know, absorb it. Why can't generators absorb it?
Okay, but I think we're not talking past each other here. I think that the core, and correct me if I'm wrong, Michelle, I just want to know, it sounds like the framework you're talking about, though, is an incentive for a resource with a capacity-type contract to perform from a capacity standpoint. Is that what you're getting at? I think that's why Anna kind of jumped to, or Brad kind of jumped to rain.
Well, I think what I'm going at is, well,
like
I don't
think without a capacity
contract. Michelle, I think I understand where you're going. You're thinking of a bigger picture perspective as you pursue, you know, changes to scarcity pricing. The question is going to be whether we have adequate measures also to ensure we don't have exercise market power at a system level. And then the question then is, with regards to performance of generators, is there some kind of disincentive, if you wish, to provide the power? And this has nothing to do with RA. You're thinking of just from a market's perspective.
No, it would have to be RA, right? I mean, you can't really punish somebody for not being around over 45,000 if they're RA. But let's say they are resource adequacy resources. You know, that is what the rain penalty. I don't particularly like the rain penalty because I don't think it's high enough, and I don't think, you know, I think people get out of it. So I'm talking about something like what they have back east, which is, you know, basically under stress system conditions, if you don't show up, there is a whopper of a penalty. And it strikes me as making sense. If you think about what happened in Texas, you know, people are paying $16,000 or $6,000 to pay their energy bills, and it's because of the forced outage of generators. You know, in the RA perspective, if the generators don't perform and we get to scarcity pricing, you know, it seems like they should take some of the pain. Now, if it's true scarcity, yeah, maybe you can go up, but why would we not want to hold generators accountable if they're supposed to be performing in 1 and 2 and certainly 1 in 10 and definitely 1 in 35 conditions?
Yeah, I guess I was confused by your comments, and that's why I was asking for clarification. So you are really looking at a resource adequacy type of penalty. We don't have capacity markets like they do by East, but you are thinking of capacity-based, like a non-performance for resources that are contracted for capacity requirements.
Right. Yes, absolutely. Okay. And I believe, back east they get capacity payments, so they're sort of the capacity market is the resource adequacy program, right?
Yeah, I think we should continue to look at that in the greater scarcity pricing initiative, and I don't want to foreclose the opportunity to talk about that kind of stuff in the greater initiative, and that's where I was trying to point us to.
Yeah, and that's fine if it goes in that, but I'd just like to say that from our perspective, that really has to be paired in that scarcity pricing initiative if that's the direction we're going to go. Even this note, we're going to go up to $2,000, but what if it's because of a resource that's on outage? Or, a forced outage that started a week earlier and went a week later. We're going to make load pay, but really, what if it's the problem of the generator being on forced outage? They don't seem to pay such a symmetric penalty. I mean, the rain penalty is half of the CPM, right, just for those days. Okay, I think you guys got my point. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, we have two more on the queue, Kira.
Yes, let's move to the next caller. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead. Caller, your device may be on mute.
Sorry about that. Thanks for letting me know. Josh Arnold, PG&E. Quick follow-up on Michelle's questions. I just wanted to get some clarification. These scarcity prices, would they be triggered if there was a significant outage on a resource that was providing ancillary services, let's say non-spin? Could that be a trigger for these penalty prices, for these scarcity prices?
No.
Okay. I'm just making sure because my concern would be when you're talking about the need to buy back power, let's say you had a large generator providing non-spin, it goes on outage, it just has to do a no-pay on its non-spin prices, and in doing so, it could, if this were a trigger, it would send the prices potentially skyrocketing. I just wanted to make sure that's not a game that can be played. So thank you very much for confirming that.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you for your question. Let's move to the last caller. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Bushnell. Can you just confirm you can hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I hear you.
Oh, great. I just want to jump in, and I want to thank Michelle for bringing up the subject matter that she did, and I found it particularly interesting. I know that it's in the context of the longer-term project, but I just wanted to echo that I think that scope makes a lot of sense to consider both of these sides. I also wanted to just kind of clarify a couple things, and so when you're thinking about that scope and what might be in that bucket, so in our markets, when you say rain, you're talking about an availability penalty, which the Eastern markets have. Like, for example, they call it a daily deficiency charge, where you have shown deficient megawatts versus your obligation. But I think what I heard Michelle talking about is the other type of penalty, not for showing, but for performance. And when an actual emergency event occurs, and call them in PJM performance assessment intervals, they get designated as a performance assessment interval, and you are obligated to provide what you got procured for capacity, not what you got procured for in the markets. And I think that's one of the fundamental differences that I see, which is that you have this availability obligation, you bid in, and whatever you're awarded, that's your obligation. From the CAISO's perspective or from the Western market perspective, it's different in the East. Even if you're only committed by the market up to 50% of your obligation, in an emergency, you are obligated to perform your full 100%, or else you are subject to those penalties. But the other piece that, and you brought up incentives and what's the right incentive, there's some powerful incentives in that construct for performance because it's not just penalty, but there's also bonus payments. And so as you're aware, you as a market have to be net neutral, right? So if you're collecting these penalties, there's a question about how do you allocate those penalty charges back out. And at least in PJM's market, the decision was made that they take all the noncompliance, all the penalty charges that they collect, and they allocate it as bonus payments to generators that overperformed relative to their obligation. So that provides an incentive not only to, you know, in my scenario, you get committed by the market at 50%, but your obligation is 100% of that obligation. It's not just, you're not just incentivized to perform up to your obligation. You're incentivized to perform beyond that so that you can get a slice of the bonus payment. And so there are some really interesting conversations in that context. And I just want to make sure you guys were aware of the bonus payment piece, because that's, when we're talking incentives for performance, that's probably, I think that is a good idea and is probably the best practice. So I'm very supportive of you guys considering that in your scarcity enhancements project. Just wanted to provide that extra context.
Thanks, Kathleen.
There are no more questions in the queue.
Okay, great. So let's go ahead and move to the next topic. So, Danny, are you on?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay.
Sure. So reliability, demand response resources. Next slide. We have a single slide that summarizes the changes we're proposing to make in our draft final proposal. The first is to dispatch RDRR in RTPD rather than RTD. We think that this will lead to a more efficient market result, since the RPTD horizon covers the resource's minimum startup plus maximum minimum runtime. Just dispatching these in RTD like is done today would not ensure that those two times are respected. Additionally, we're proposing to enable 5- and 15-minute discrete RDRR resources to set the price in FMM by treating the resources as discrete in the scheduling run, but continuous in the pricing run. So the 5-minute dispatchable would be able to set the price in RTD and FMM, the 15-minute just in FMM. Any resources that are 60-minute dispatchable would be treated as price takers in RTPD, consistent with how we treat other block hourly resources. This is all a change because right now RDRR is only able to register as 5-minute dispatchable. The final change is we are going to be making some internal system adjustments to account for the load forecast, or to enable the load forecast to recognize the RDRR dispatch, so you don't get into that price suppression effect where RDRs get dispatched, show up as less load, the market requirements then see less load and subsequently ramp down other resources or don't clear imports. So we should be able to avoid that situation with these changes. That's all I have on RDRR. I'd like to open it up for questions if anybody has a question.
We do have a
Kara, is anything? Okay, go ahead.
Let's move to the first caller. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with Clica. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I've got two questions. First is, could you please explain what's the difference between what is RTPD and how it differs from either what's shown as RTD or the FFM, which I understand is the 15-minute market. Could you sort of offer a little bit of insight of what's going on in all that jumbles of letters?
Okay, so RTD is our 5-minute market. RTPD is our 15-minute dispatch. The FMM is the binding interval of that 15-minute dispatch. We run advisory dispatches out farther, but the FMM is the binding RTPD run.
Wait, say that again? RTPD is the what of the 15-minute run?
RTPD is just a 15-minute optimization where we are committing resources. The FMM is the binding one of those. When we run the RTPD, we don't just run for the next 15 minutes. We look out farther into the future. The interval, which the result of that are binding, would be the FMM.
Is that referred to, because within the 15-minute market, there's some of the runs which you have that occurs like once per hour, which dispatch slow start resources. Is that what you're talking about?
I think what you're referring to is the HASP run, which is another RTPD run.
RTPD is where we look anywhere from 7 15-minute intervals down to 4 15-minute intervals into the future, with the second interval in each of those different market runs is the FMM.
Okay.
And one of the
so RP
and the HASP is one of those runs.
So RPDT is one of the HASP runs.
HASP is one of the RTPD runs.
So, sorry, yes, the other way. HASP is one of the RPTD runs. Okay. So does that mean RDR resources can get dispatched, I guess, down there in the 15-minute run, either every 15 minutes or on an hourly basis? Is that what's happening? Is that there's, I guess, is there more granularity as of this change or less granularity? I guess that's what I'm trying to, from the status quo.
I don't quite follow the granularity aspect of it. RTD right now, I think what you're trying to ask is, what is the change with this first bullet, moving between RTPD and RTD? Is that what you're trying to get at? So the RTD horizon, I think, looks at 12 or 13 5-minute intervals. So the longest horizon it's optimizing over is about an hour. The RTPD horizon looks out up to 7 15-minute intervals. So the RDRRs can have a startup time of up to 40 minutes and a maximum minimum runtime of an hour. So if you add those two together, you have an hour and 40 minutes. If they're just considered for optimization in RTD, it's not even optimizing them. The horizon it's looking at doesn't meet those two variables. So by putting it in RTD, we should at least, it considers it in a longer time frame.
Okay, that's helpful. So RDR resources will be looked at in a longer time frame. Okay. So my next question that I have is the load forecast and the RDR dispatch. So when you dispatch RDR, you're going to then add that amount of load back into the forecast. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, we're going to be adding that back into the market requirements that are the load forecast that gets sent to the market for balancing purposes.
So the market's going to balance for a higher load than what actually exists?
No. If you don't do this, there's a double counting because this isn't, it's modeled as a generator, but it doesn't show up as a generator. It shows up as less load.
Oh, okay. So then over what time duration then does this load forecast adjustment is in place then?
Well, the load forecast adjustment would respect whatever the market dispatch is for that resource. So if a 10 megawatt resource gets dispatched for the next 4 hours, the load forecast that is consumed by the market would show 10 megawatts higher to account for that difference.
Okay, so whatever the model says that it's going to be dispatching it for, then it will add that load back to prevent the double counting. Okay.
Yes, that's our intent.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
Let's move to the next question, Karen. Go ahead. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead. Caller, your device.
Hello?
Mute. Oh, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Usually it speaks to my phone and I can hear it. This is Michelle Kita from the CPUC again. I was wondering if you can clarify what the bid price is for RDRR. I feel like there was some confusion about it, and you guys released it at $950 to $1,000, and I just wanted to clarify that that's still the case under 831.
Yeah. So thanks for the question, Michelle. The bid cap is tied to, or the dollar value is tied to 95 to 100% of the soft bid cap, which is, my understanding, still defined as $1,000. So it would be between $950 and $1,000.
Okay, great. And that doesn't change even, that's going to be, that's it. So it's tied to the soft bid cap, not changes to the 2000. I think I'm understanding you. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Moving to the next caller. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. So I know we don't have time now. I know you're very busy before you go to the board, but I'm wondering if afterward, if the CAISO can go through these proposals and actually quantify the impacts they would have had on pricing over last summer. It occurs to me that between the last two policies that you've discussed, there hopefully would be some sort of impact. But as we get more clarity around these, I actually am thinking the impact is less than maybe I would have hoped and Michelle fears. For example, I'm looking at the contingency dispatch, not to get into more acronym soup, but the RTCD, and it looks like that only happened for one 15-minute interval. So prices, so per the last proposal, that really would only impact one 15-minute interval on the day. And it looks like this won't impact as much either, now that we're getting into the details. So just a request, if at all possible, I know you don't have time now, but to really consider, putting some bounds on the impact of this so stakeholders know what to expect if there is, some sort of emergency this summer.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. I think I'll defer to my management on the type of commitment we can make to doing that, but I think we understand your concern.
Thanks.
On the one thing I would add on the RDRR is just getting these into the market, even if it isn't sending the price. If there's a large amount of them that are 60-minute dispatchables and they're treated as price takers, that still, I think, has a positive impact because they're not being dispatched out of merit, which would suppress market prices and suppress the potential for imports to clear.
Yes, I think we're very supportive of both of the proposals, and we think the CAISO absolutely should move forward with them. Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest this wasn't a good policy or wouldn't have any impact, only that maybe it wasn't quite as large of an impact as I initially thought.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions, Kiara?
Yes, let's move to the next caller in the queue. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, it's Mark with Calpine. Hey, for some reason, my hand's been lowered twice. I don't know what's going on here, but something wasn't working. Anyhow, Danny, thank you for this proposal. We'll certainly support it. And by the way, I'm not paranoid. It really happened. I'm not sure I understand if 60-minute RDR is a price taker, how it can set price.
I think that your observation is correct. That one would not be able to set the price. It would only be the 5 and the 15-minute RDRR.
Okay, and as a matter of fact, it could have a suppressive effect on the price because it's a price taker, but it's going to reduce load. But on the other hand, I guess you're going to add that load back in. So maybe it won't reduce price, suppress price. Okay, so, and how much of the RDRR is 60 minutes? Is all the air conditioning stuff, the 1,500 megawatts, all 60 minutes?
That I don't think that we have a firm grasp on because right now it's all registered as 5 minute. I do know that we have some that is registered as 15-minute continuous right now. That would, if it retains that registration, still be able to set the price, but I don't think that we will know until the program administrators change their registration.
Okay, and is there anything that would prohibit resources from moving from 5-minute, which sets price, up to a 60-minute dispatchable, which doesn't set price?
No,
there counting or RA requirements?
I do not believe so, but I would defer to somebody on our RA team on that.
Well, this is the waiver. I would say it's a master file. It's a master file characteristic, so it has to accurately represent their operational characteristics. It's not, a free will choice here.
Okay.
It has to be that they're too slow to move at 5 or 15 minutes.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks. There's a statement here that says it's going to treat the resource as discrete in the scheduling run, but continuous in the pricing run. Can you give me like the 101 version of what that distinction is trying to point to?
So my understanding is that the discrete resources are not able to set the price in the pricing run. And so this is just a market mechanic to get around that. And I'd defer to George if you want to provide like a more detailed explanation of this.
All right. Well, I don't know if George is still on. I assume discrete means a block load of some kind. And what I hope continuous means is that even though it may be a block load reduction, the pricing run is going to consider it dispatchable at any level within that block. Is that what's intended here?
Yes.
Okay, so in that regard, it's kind of like the constrained output generation modeling. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. I actually think that a lot of the code that supports that will be adapted to support this.
Okay. All right. So if in fact it's dispatched, but in a subsequent interval, only half of it is needed, the software will be able to still use that resource to meet the ongoing need in a subsequent interval. Okay. I think that's what you're saying. Boy, this needs to be explained a little bit more, hopefully, between now and the time you file your tariff. But thanks. Those are two clarifications I wanted to make. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for your question.
One more in the queue. Go ahead.
The last caller. Your line's been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This is Alba PG&E. Just wanted to, this slide is interesting and it's sort of a follow-up on what Mark's string of questions. It looks to me like you're saying RDRR will only be dispatched in the 15-minute process, but that depending on your choice in the master file, you may receive different prices. So if you're in either case 5-minute dispatchable or 15-minute dispatchable, you're only going to be dispatched in the 15-minute market, RTPD, but you will set prices differently in the two cases, even though you won't be operated differently. Am I understanding that correctly?
I would have to, I didn't quite follow. So can you try to rephrase the question, Alva?
Sure. So it says RDRR resources can only be dispatched in RTPD because you use the rather than RTD there. So it's not going to be dispatched. These will not be dispatched in RTD according to that first bullet. They'll be dispatched in RTPD.
I understand.
So
yeah. So
given that, yeah, they're only going to get one dispatch instruction for the 15-minute period. In either case, there'll be no difference in terms of the dispatch instruction or what they're expected to do. But in one case, they can set prices in 3 5-minute intervals, and in the other, they can set prices in 1 15-minute interval.
So I think that
Danny, this is Brad. I think with the clarification, like it says on the slide, 5-minute dispatchable RDR can set the price, the 5-minute prices in RTD and FMM, the 15-minute dispatchable, because it's only. Okay, I thought you guys were saying.
Yeah. No, that's but it's just a little peculiar because since the two resources can't be used differently, I'm a little concerned about this idea that just by defining yourself as 5-minute, even though you won't get dispatched 5-minute, you have some influence on prices that you're not really you're not really affecting the 5-minute market, and yet you're allowed to set prices in that. So I don't know whether that's something you should think about, but it just doesn't seem quite right. Thanks.
Yeah, but I think that just to clarify, we would move to dispatch them in RTPD in addition to RTD, and I agree that rather looks exclusionary of RTD. We would not propose, like, we're not trying to take anything away from these resources. We're just trying to add them to RTPD as well.
That makes a lot more sense then. Okay, thank you very much.
We have no further inquiries.
Okay. We will move on to the next topic. So, Gabe, are you on the line?
I am, Christina.
Oh, great. Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm here, and I think I have the honor of the last topic of the day today. I'm also told we have a hard stop at 3 o'clock, so I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as possible so that we can take a few questions. You know, one thing that we've heard from a lot of the presenters and a lot of the commentary is just that we've been moving incredibly quickly in this process, and I think that that's true. While the topics that I'm going to talk about, the minimum stated charge requirement, is something that's being developed in the resource adequacy enhancements, which is sort of moving at a pace that's a little bit closer to our normal stakeholder process pace. So I think most of the participants on this call have seen sort of the glimpse of what we were planning to do in resource adequacy enhancements in the last presentation. And now, since that last presentation, we've actually put out our final proposal, which we're, again, planning to implement by summer 2021, which does include the full description of the minimum stated charge requirement, and it includes a lot of the changes that I hinted at that it would include in the last presentation that I gave in this forum. And just to be frank, we haven't had any updates since then. So here's where we're at. ISO is expecting a lot of storage capacity to be online, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1,800 megawatts of resource adequacy capacity from storage resources on our system by August 1st, 2021. Today, we have about 400 megawatts of resource adequacy capacity from storage available. And last summer, if we can recall back that far, it was only about 200 megawatts of storage. So we're really looking at a large increase between today and this summer. And then next summer, we're anticipating another large increase from additional lithium-ion storage coming onto our system. Most of the new storage, as I mentioned, is going to have an online date or a COD date of August 1st of 2021. So we will anticipate that all coming on the system at about the same time, or most of that storage capacity coming on the system at about the same time. What we've been proposing, and again, this is a component of the Resource Adequacy Enhancements Initiative, is a new tool called the Minimum Stated Charge Requirement. Essentially what this tool does is it ensures that storage resources that have a discharge schedule have enough stated charge to be able to meet that discharge schedule. As you know, as I talk about in the Resource Adequacy Enhancements paper, this is a problem that is solved relatively easily from the construct that we have in our day-ahead market process, but it's a problem that we don't have as much control over in the real-time process, mainly because the 5-minute market only looks out 13 intervals in advance, so about an hour. So we don't have the look ahead in the real-time market to see potential needs for storage resources potentially several hours later in our markets. We are requesting this authority through the Resource Adequacy Enhancements Initiative. The authority would be in place prior to summer 2021, and that's moved up from a date where we had originally anticipating releasing this in our fall 2021 release. We are also requesting, and this is one of the refinements that we've made, that this tool have a 2-year sunset period. So we're planning to implement it for this summer, so it would be in place for 2 summers. And then in the meantime, we're going to be kicking off a new policy proposal through the Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative. We're planning to get that started probably in April of 2021, so that's coming up as soon as we get this summer 2021 preparedness proposal through past the Board of Governors. The idea here, and I think the cornerstone of this policy, would be to develop a market-based tool to procure stated charge from these storage resources and provide compensation for that product. One of the major criticisms about the MSOC tool that we're putting in place is that it doesn't provide adequate compensation for these storage resources. We acknowledge that in the time that we have between now and the summer, when we're going to have all these resources, storage resources on our grid, we want to make sure that we have some tool in place to do this. So if we can advance to slide 37, please. We've also made additional refinements to the tool, to the minimum stated charge requirement tool. And specifically, we're only planning to impose this requirement on days when we think the needs in the system are critical. We talked about this at several previous meetings and through the Resource Adequacy Enhancements Initiative itself. The original proposal was to apply this on all or most days, and specifically on days when storage resources could be the only resources that would be possible to serve load on the system. But we've dropped that back even further, and now we're only planning to apply this on days when there's very critical system needs, and specifically we'd be determining those needs based on the RUC process and whether or not there was a RUC in feasibility. So if we run our day-ahead process and our RUC process, and it's determined that one of those hours it's infeasible for us to serve load, those are the days that we'd be applying the minimum stated charge requirement. On other days, we would not be applying that requirement. For frame of reference here, the RUC market had infeasibilities for 23 days during 2020. Obviously, 2020 was a very high heat year with some pretty extreme weather. And we would expect that that would sort of be an absolute upper threshold of how often we might use this tool going forward. 2019 and 2018, there's actually only one RUC in feasibility in each of those 2 years. So if temperatures are a little bit more normal and we have a mild summer, we might only activate the minimum stated charge requirement, say a handful of times. Operators are going to have the ability in the real-time market to evaluate actual real-time conditions and potentially drop a minimum stated charge requirement if it was initiated through a RUC and feasibility, or in the event that it wasn't initiated in the previous day, they will have the ability to initiate a minimum stated charge requirement. I think there's a time window that we list in our paper, say between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m., when operators are able to make the call on whether or not we're going to have minimum stated charge requirements imposed in the market or not. And we will be, we'll be fully transparent about when we're calling this tool or when we're not calling this tool. Also, the idea here to allow operators this ability to call a minimum stated charge requirement or not would be based on similar triggers to RUC and feasibilities. So if in real time the situations materialize and things are significantly better than they were in the RUC process, and now suddenly what looked like a RUC and feasibility when the RUC market actually ran in the real-time market, things weren't as bad, they could cancel that minimum stated charge requirement. If, however, RUC ran, there were no infeasibilities, and system conditions deteriorated, say some units tripped and they weren't going to be back online that same day, there was an extreme weather event like a fire or something like that, which was causing challenges on the grid, those would be the sort of conditions where operators say, okay, we need to impose minimum stated charge requirements today in the real-time market. In thinking about these requirements, we're really designing these to have a reduced impact on the actual storage resources. We understand that storage is going to be critical to evolving our markets. We don't want to disincentivize storage from joining our markets, but at the same time, we feel like that there's certain needs that we have to have from storage to ensure that we have, and we're able to reliably operate our grid. Operators are going to be able to determine a set of critical hours. Generally, we would expect these critical hours to be during the evening net load peak periods, say hour ending 17, hour ending 22, or something like that. And these would be set on a case-by-case basis in advance of the minimum stated charge requirement being triggered in that RUC process. The critical hours would be determined, and once they're determined, any discharge schedule that a storage resource has during those critical hours, that would be what would be calculated for the minimum stated charge requirement that would actually be imposed on those resources. And again, and this is something we talked about last time, the minimums would be imposed on the hours directly adjacent to the discharge hours. So if you were scheduled to discharge in, say, hours ending 17, 18, and 19, you would likely have a minimum stated charge requirement imposed in hours ending 16, 15, and 14, and you might have one in hour ending 13, depending on the round-trip efficiency of the resource. The idea here would be that we wouldn't be requiring a specific stated charge for a long duration of time for these resources. As I mentioned, the ISO will be communicating when these requirements are imposed. We'll also, and we've committed to reporting on when the ISO uses the minimum stated charge requirement. We may also, and to the extent we can, report on impacts that the minimum stated charge may have had on storage resources operating in the market for a particular day, to hopefully find out, A, is this tool effective? Is it needed? And then B, how much potential harm is this causing? In the meantime, we will be working on our new tool to replace the minimum stated charge requirement after it sunsets after the 2 years. That is all I had in terms of material. Maybe we have time for one quick question, and then I'll turn it back over to James to wrap up. Operator, do we have any comments?
Yes, let's go to the first caller. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, Gabe. This is Alva, PG&E.
Hey, Alva.
I look forward to talking to you more about this tomorrow in the RA initiative. But one point I do want to make about unforeseen effects. Your examples in the RA write-up sort of point to one thing that's of concern. Paul Nelson of CLECA was talking about this issue, and I see it even in the example you're drawing up, that it's possible that the minimum stated charge requirement would lead to additional load being placed on the system immediately before the hours that had been previously identified as critical. And in the example you gave, the battery had to charge at full in hour 18 in order to be at a minimum stated charge at the end of hour 18. Magnify that by a factor of 10, and you've got 500 megawatts of load charging in an hour directly adjacent to an hour that you had considered critical. So I think that's, and of course that could also happen right after a period when you had been discharging a lot of batteries for critical needs. So defining it strictly as based on the intervals where there are discharge schedules could lead to some unforeseen consequences. So just one point to be thinking about in terms of the summer than in terms of the implementation at the end of the year. The use of this as an emergency measure has, may have some unpredictable side effects. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Alva. I think that's a really good point, and that was something that, the ISO had raised previously when we had gotten comments to say, hey, look, why aren't you imposing this requirement, as close to the discharge schedule as possible? Because the longer you have the requirement in place, the more time a storage resource could potentially be held out of the market. And I think our logic was very similar to what you just walked through. Well, if we charge this thing up during the lowest priced hours or the actual charging schedule, theoretically the day-ahead market's done a good job in sort of picking, the best or the optimal hours to charge these resources. So we should also be imposing this requirement, and it should be helping with that problem. Part of the change here is to say, well, we really do want to impact these storage resources as little as possible. And I think we realize full well that this could have some unintended consequences in those hours immediately prior to big discharge schedules for storage resources. One of the things that, and this is certainly one of the items that we've had conversations with our operations team internally about, and we're already starting to think about ways to deal with this. One of the things that our operations team has offered up to us, and this is included in the write-up in the resource adequacy enhancements proposal, is that we've got a slider or a scaler that's valued between 0.0 up to 1.0, and effectively a 1.0 means that we anticipate storage resources charging sort of at their PMIN or at their full charging capability, and then a slider of 0.75 indicates that they would be charging at 3/4 of their PMIN, and then so on. And the idea would be that the operations team could sort of tune that sliding value to a place where they wouldn't get in a situation where the charging schedules then cause potential infeasibilities or market issues in those hours immediately prior to the discharge schedules. So it is one thing we've thought about. We certainly can talk more about this in our upcoming meeting.
Yeah, I look forward to hearing that.
Great. Thanks, Alva. With that, I know it's 2:58, so I might turn this back over to James to wrap up for today.
Okay, thank you, Gabe. All right, James, you on?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
So I'll take the last couple of slides. Next slide, please. So I'll report back on these sort of miscellaneous items in this topic that we had opened for additional stakeholder suggestions in our scoping call, and do appreciate the ones that we received. We will be proceeding with 2 of the 3 topics that we've considered in our SHROP proposal. We are moving forward with a new OASIS report that shows gross exports and imports by intertie. We are also moving forward with some BPM changes related to the independent study interconnection process, where we will remove the 100 megawatt or 125% cap on behind-the-meter expansion requests, and also enable the ISO to award available deliverability temporarily to online projects until earlier queued projects come online. We have decided not to move forward with the resource adequacy availability incentive mechanism or RAIM changes that we considered in the SHROP proposal, and that is for a handful of reasons. One, there didn't seem to be a lot of traction in terms of stakeholder support for those items. In fact, we did receive a few comments that stakeholders were concerned, since the RA contracting year has already started, that it could cause issues on a contracting basis. We also figured that the issues that we identified related to RAIN were not among the list of things identified in the root cause analysis as things contributing to last summer's events. And finally, we decided that in light of those things that we could take this off of the scope for the summer to make room for other changes that we have. But that's not to say that, some of the changes that we're considered under this umbrella for RAIM are not important to think about in the future. Next slide. So the last slide I'll present is the proposed EIM governing body approval classifications for each topic. So there's only 5 topics listed here, and the reason is that the storage topic doesn't have any proposals involving tariff changes under the umbrella of this project, for this initiative. Neither do the OASIS report and interconnection enhancements that I mentioned in the previous slide. So we're only looking at these 5 topics here. For the export load and wheeling priorities, we're proposing an advisory role for the EIM governing body as it involves generally applicable rules in the real-time market. For the EIM coordination and EIM resource sufficiency test review, we are recommending a primary approval classification for the EIM governing body on that one, as those rules are EIM specific. For the market incentives for imports under tight system conditions, we are recommending no approval authority for the EIM governing body for that topic. As this is generally, this change does not apply to the entire real-time market and does not affect participation in the EIM. For real-time scarcity pricing enhancements, we're recommending an advisory approval role for the EIM governing body, as again, it involves generally applicable rules in the real-time market. And then finally, for the RDRR proposals, we are proposing no role for the EIM governing body, as the RDR topic affects only California emergency DR programs as they relate to Cal ISO resource adequacy.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and cover the next steps. We are out of time. So we are asking for stakeholders to submit written comments on the draft final proposal. Those are going to be due this Friday by end of day. We did post a comments template out on the initial webpage, so please use that. It's the comments template in the tools, so please use that for when submitting your comments. We did post the draft tariff language last Thursday. We also issued a notice about, just to inform you about a meeting that we're having Friday to go over the draft tariff language as well as the business requirement specifications. So that will be this coming Friday. Details are also on the initial webpage. As far as comments on the tariff and the BRS, those are going to be due March 3rd. And so I'll make sure that the template is available before our meeting this coming Friday. And then we are looking to ask the EMSC to adopt, the call to adopt MSC opinion. We don't have a date for that yet, but we will issue a market notice once we have those details. And then we are planning to go to the EIM governing body meeting March 10th, and then the ISO Board of Governors meeting at the end of March. And then the target is to implement these changes by June 1st in time for summer. So that is all I have. The last slide is just to point you to the template. So we are out of time. Do we have anybody in the queue, Kira?
There are no further questions in the queue.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, everybody, for participating today. Greatly appreciate it. Thanks, Kira, for your help. Enjoy the rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may all disconnect.